We start off with a fringe theory that basically got its start way back on the early conspiracy icebergs. Essentially, it states that molecules are actually visible to the naked eye. This one was more of a joke theory, or just a way to get people hopelessly researching a topic and wasting time, because this one is certainly not true, and it's basically viewed as a meme type theory anyways. Speaking of meme theories, the fish monster at the window internet legend is another one of these that was most likely submitted as a joke. The picture actually traces its origin back to a now defunct website found via the web archive called www.ghoststudy.com. On this site, they had a feature where readers could submit their own mysterious photos that would then be nominated for Mystery Photo of the Month. Once submitted, other members on the website could speculate on what it was they were looking at. In this one, from June 2001, a woman named Andrea would submit a picture of her dog laying on the bed with a window behind him. But what's important is the thing, whatever it is, in the window. Andrea claimed upon seeing the photo after it was developed, she was struck with fear, and it made her afraid to even go into the backyard at night. The photo, as you see here, doesn't look that frightening or mysterious. Actually, most of the comments suggested it's simply the reflection of an object on the bed, like a blanket or laundry, and that the flash from the camera wouldn't even illuminate outside objects unless you were standing right up on the glass. Others suggested a smudge in the window or some kind of optical illusion, and sadly, some of the comments actually thought it was some kind of demon or entity. If you follow the channel and watch the historical mystery series, you probably remember that recently we discussed the whole Bell Witch saga, which allegedly took place in Tennessee between the years of 1817 and 1821. Now that story is a mess unto itself, and I recommend you checking it out if you haven't yet. But since this is the obscure series, and since the Bell Witch isn't that obscure, we're going to discuss one very tiny detail in that story, one that is often overlooked. Shortly before the arrival of the witch, the patriarch of the family, John Bell, was out working on his farm inspecting the corn, when in the middle of a corn row, a weird creature appeared. It had the body of a black dog, but the head of a rabbit. John pulled out his gun, took aim, and fired. Nothing happened, so he shot several more times, and then the animal simply stared and vanished. It's somewhat strange that such little detail is given in that throwaway sentence. It's never followed up on, because what happens afterwards is the arrival of the witch, and that overshadows this weird creature. But the weird creature was no doubt a cryptid, and that's the mystery on this one. What the heck was this thing that barely gets any discussion in the saga of the Bell Witch? It's not elaborated on much, but some people claim it was the witch's familiar, which is a creature that has a close relationship with the witch, and that it was an omen of what was to come. Others cite the whole thing was just an addition to the original story, or it could have been that John just hallucinated the whole thing. Keenan's Land / Tokpuk Island are two islands that allegedly lay off the coast of Alaska and thus classified as American territory, but have since been lost since their discovery in the late 19th and early 20th century. Keenan's Land was discovered by accident when famous explorer Captain John Keenan was taking his vessel out to Point Barrow, the northernmost point of America, when the ship would run into strong winds that destroyed the ship and left it drifting hopelessly in the sea, and it luckily would eventually run up onto a strip of land. The men got off the boat and pulled out their maps to see where they had landed, and lo and behold, they found an island that had never been documented. So Captain Keenan would take the American flag from the ship and place it on the highest point on the island. Once they got onto another ship and made it safely back home, they telegraphed the finding back to Washington, D.C., and the land was officially named Keenan's Land. The only problem was it was never found again, even though other famous explorers have searched for it, including Roald Amundsen, whom we discussed back in the historical series. Later explorers began to suggest that the island never existed, and it's unsure exactly where Captain Keenan landed. Tokpuk Island, on the other hand, was discovered by an Eskimo named Tokpuk, whom in September 1931 led a party of whale hunters far north of Alaska and came across an island. It was about 85 miles north of Flaxman Island, and east of Point Barrow. It was about half a mile long and about the same width, with its highest point being about 50 feet. It did have vegetation, but no driftwood. The island, once reported back to DC, was named after Takpuk, which would have moved the US border to its northernmost point. Takpuk would eventually take Arctic explorer and ethnologist Vilhelmur Stevenson to the island, who vouched for the finding. In this case, several photos of the island were taken, although I could not find any online. In both cases, the islands have never been seen again. Keenan's Land is most often suggested to have been an ice island, which is essentially a gigantic iceberg several miles in size, and have a flat shape that makes you think that it's actually a piece of land instead of ice, and it eventually melts or breaks up, and thus the island is never found again. But in the case of Takpuk Island, considering it had vegetation, an ice island has been ruled out, but there is a thought that Keenan's Land and Takpuk Island are one and the same. You may have heard of Ogopogo, the Canadian lake monster inhabiting Okanagan Lake, said to be a long serpent-like creature with multiple humps. Or maybe you've even heard of Caddy, another sea serpent that is said to live in Cadboro Bay, but there is one Canadian water cryptid that overshadows them all, the Dildo Monster. That's right, the Dildo Monster, said to inhabit Dildo Pond, about a quarter of a mile inland from Dildo Harbor. It's said to be about 50 feet long, with a head about 3 feet long, shaped like that of an eel, with bulging frog-like eyes, and a 5-foot neck that is slimmer than its body, which is about the size of a rum cask. It seems to swim with its head out of water at a great speed, and only emerges when it's very, very wet. Apparently, fish in the pond began to vanish once it was originally sighted, which brought biologists and scientists to the area to interview locals and study the pond. After deep probing for weeks, the research did not reach a climax. Laundry sink cans. For this one, we have to go back to the web archives and visit a site known as UFOfreeparanormal.com, where visitors to the site could submit their own UFO paranormal stories. The following came from a man named Barney Woodard, who emailed on June 21st, 2008, and told a very bizarre story. According to Barney, when he was a small child, about 4 to 5 years old, he was in the basement in the laundry room with his mom, who was doing laundry. While leaning on a deep washroom sink, he would look down curiously to see a green hand coming from the drain. It had long fingernails and moved its fingers all around the basin. He screamed, of course, but when his mom looked, it had already disappeared. Fast forward a few years, and he was at a family reunion, and everyone was standing around talking about weird things that had happened to them over the years, and his nephew would begin to tell a story of a day he had seen a green hand in a laundry tub sink when he was a little boy. When asked for more details about the event, he stated he did not desire to go into any more details about it, but a few minutes later he did say, "One thing I do remember was that had," and right at the same time, Barney chimed in and said, "Long fingernails?" His nephew never elaborated anymore, but Barney emailed in asking if anyone else had heard of a similar sighting. So what to make of it? Assuming he didn't make the story up, this is one of the easier theories actually. Kids' visual systems and imaginations work differently than adults, and what Barney likely seen was just a rag, a drain cover, or a pattern of grime he thought was a hand. Leaning over a deep sink at that vantage point messed with his perception, and over the years, it's likely that his memory distorted it even more. Sunspot activity with historical warfare. We have discussed the moon's effect on people's psychological states, so it stands to reason that there are a group of people who also believe the sun influences our mood, more specifically, sunspot activity. And it's not that it just affects one or two people. This fringe theory states that mankind as a whole is impacted. But before we delve into this theory, let's take a look at sunspot activity to get a better understanding. Sunspots are dark, cooler areas on the sun's surface caused by magnetic field disturbances, resulting in a temperature that is about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, which can result in more solar flares and higher overall radiation output. They were first documented by telescope in 1610 by Galileo and a few others, and over the time spent studying them since, we have come to learn that the number of sunspots rise and fall on a predictable pattern. For example, every 27 days we see a short-term cycle of solar activity, while every 11 years we see a longer magnetic cycle, and finally, one more at around 90 years. And scientists speculate there could be even longer patterns of time we just haven't observed yet. Now that we have explained that, let's take a closer look at the theory itself, which basically states during these longer patterns of solar activity, like the one that occurs every 11 years, there is an uptick in warfare, with several examples: the American Revolution, French Revolution, War of 1812, the American Civil War, Russian Revolution, World War I, Hungarian Uprising, end of communism, and 9/11. All occurred during these times of high solar activity. There's even some data that shows the US interventions into the Middle East all occurred at these times as well. But as mentioned, it's more of a fringe theory than anything else. But if you're curious, we entered the last cycle in 2023, so there's that. Kriegerstown Jabberwocks. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the story of Alice in Wonderland, but I wonder if you remember the creature, Jabberwock, the terrifying large dragon-like beast. It's okay if you don't remember it, because the real mystery here is the cryptid that would take the name later on. 1890, Kriegerstown, Maryland. A mysterious creature was spotted, which was described as being lizard-headed, humpbacked, long-tailed, and web-footed. After some locals were made aware of its presence, they began to look for the creature by following the tracks that it had left, and they apparently followed it from Kriegerstown to Grayson and then Thurmont, about a 5-mile trail in total. This led to the creature earning the moniker in the local papers, Jabberwock, probably because Alice in Wonderland was still fresh on the minds of people. Now there are several strange things about this account, which we have very limited info on. First of all, this allegedly happened in 1890, but the article that actually tells us the story came out on December 1st, 1932 in the Frederick News. But making it even weirder was this article was reprinted in the 4th issue of the Bigfoot Abstract that came out in July 1988, which suggests they at least thought it was Bigfoot related. I tried to find more appearances of this cryptid, and there are a few reports between the 1870s and 1890s, but all of the descriptions vary. And just like the other, the articles are printed decades after the event, but we'll stick to the one seen by numerous people in Kriegerstown, and most likely, what they really seen was a river otter. The lizard head fits the elongated snout, along with the web-footed tracks and long tail. The inorganic evolves via our tool use. This is another fringe theory that basically suggests that inorganic matter evolves via our tool use. For example, mankind develops a flint hammer. This allows for more precise shaping of materials, but it also creates a feedback loop because now we can make more complex tools. So now these complex tools are eventually made, and mankind's brain gets a little bit smarter and sees new challenges and makes more complex tools, which then makes mankind's brain smarter, and on, and on, and on. You get it. It's supposed to show the relationship between us and inorganic matter is symbiotic. So in summary, we act as an evolutionary driver for inorganic matter, and it does the same for us. Ancient skyscrapers. Okay, how about a trivia question now? What year did the first official skyscraper finish construction? Give up? Well, it's sort of a trick question, because it depends on what you consider a skyscraper to be. Some claim the Equitable Life building, constructed in 1870, was, all because it was the first tall office building to have an elevator. However, it's the Home Insurance Building of Chicago, constructed in 1885, that most scholars point to as the first true modern skyscraper. And I use that word modern because it's key to this conspiracy, which states that ancient skyscrapers existed as well. Now, if you're a history buff, or even do a cursory Google search, you'll quickly find a city called Shibam, located in Yemen. It's famous for its mud brick made high-rise buildings, which see some of them stretch as high as 11 stories. And the interesting part was it was built all the way back into the 3rd century AD and has been inhabited ever since. Logically, just looking at these buildings, many have made the argument that these were the first true skyscrapers in history, which means the conspiracy is true, right? Well, not exactly, because our conspiracy specifically states that skyscrapers in the modern sense as we know them existed back then too. This one I couldn't find much about, and it seems to be more of a joke conspiracy than a real one, because although there were huge structures back in ancient times, none of them were similar or as tall as modern skyscrapers. Serial defecator of London. Another roundup, another pooper. This time, we go to London, England in March 2017, when a man in his 50s began hitting one suburb with poo assaults. This particular suburb, Eastlands Crescent, was a bit special though, as it's one of the more affluent neighborhoods where houses typically sell for about £1.5 million. The suspect was eventually captured on footage, and the police and social media passed around the image in hopes that someone would identify him, as they believed this was not the first time he had done this. It's just that the other victims have never reported it. Next, Shrek Public Defecator. Man, what is it with these poopers? This time, he was the Universal Orlando Resort Park, a place where a bathroom is essentially always within a 1-minute walk. But back in 2021, near the exit of the Shrek 4D, a Universal guest was making his way out the building when he seen another guest just stop right there on the stairs and drop a dookie right in front of him. And while people can get sick and not make it to the restroom in time, this was not one of those cases. Instead, it just seemed like he wanted to do it. These people are driving me crazy. Next, Servant Girl Annihilator. If you have watched this series for a while, you know I rarely ever throw unsolved murders into the Small Mystery Roundup segment, only in rare occasions with unique circumstances, and that's what we have here. But before I get to those circumstances, let's take a look at the case details. The Servant Girl Annihilator was a serial killer operating in Austin, Texas, almost a complete year between December 30th, 1884 and December 24th, 1885. His victim profile, as the name hints, was usually black servant girls for the more wealthy white families in the area, although they weren't always servants, white, or even female, which is why he also garnered the nickname Midnight Assassin. As mentioned, the attack started on December 30th, 1884, when a 25-year-old, Molly Smith, was murdered. She was a black cook who was found in the snow with a gaping hole in her head, as she had been attacked by an axe. Her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, was arrested and charged, in spite of the fact he had been attacked too. Those charges were ultimately dropped. Next was Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, two Swedish servant girls who were viciously attacked March 19th, 1885, but survived. This was just 3 months after the first attack. 2 months later, on May 7th, was 30-year-old Eliza Shelley, who was not as lucky, as she was killed with an axe while she slept. This was followed 2 weeks later on May 23rd, when 33-year-old Irene Cross was stabbed to death in her bed. This was followed later in August by an attack on a woman named Clara Dick, who survived but was left seriously wounded. By the end of August, the youngest victim, Mary Ramey, 11 years old, was assaulted and then murdered, while her mother Rebecca was left seriously wounded. About a month after this, in late September, 25-year-old Orange Washington was killed with an axe while he slept. This was the first male victim, but he was only attacked because he was asleep next to his 20-year-old girlfriend, Gracie Vance, who was also attacked while she slept, and then carried into the backyard where she was found violated and murdered. There were 2 other people in the room that night that were also attacked, Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson, 17 years old, who both escaped with injuries. This is when things would amp up, because up to this point, all of the victims were African American, and although it did cause quite a scare in Austin, it reached a fever pitch when on Christmas Eve, 41-year-old Susan Hancock was murdered with an axe while she slept and then dragged out into the backyard, followed later that night by Eula Phillips, 17 years old, who was attacked while sleeping and dragged into the backyard, violated, and murdered. Her husband was also attacked, 24-year-old James Phillips, but he survived. The last 2 victims were white and sent shockwaves through Austin. The city was bordering on becoming a police state, with more active patrols than ever, and even the governor became involved. Now let's get to the reasons why I put it in the Small Mystery Roundup. Well, for one, we're missing a lot of the records. It's been close to 150 years, and a lot of the original documents have been lost or never existed in the first place. Secondly, the case has largely been overshadowed by another killer you may have heard of. That's right, Jack the Ripper, whose reign of terror began 4 years later and went on to become the most written about serial killer ever, leaving very few authors to tackle the servant girl annihilator. This also leads to the last reason I included it here. Many armchair sleuths, and especially ripperologists, have tried to claim the servant girl annihilator, felt the heat growing in Texas, and promptly fled to London, where he continued his attacks 2 years later. However, there is no evidence for that, and it is a stretch at best. In fact, we pretty much know who the killer was, a 19-year-old African-American cook named Nathan Elgin. And how do we know it was him? There are quite a few clues that pretty much confirm it, although it will never be 100%. First of all, were a few of the murder scenes, in which the victim wore no shoes and left bloody footprints. They were distinctive because the killer's right foot was missing his little toe, which Elgin was missing. Secondly, he was apprehended in the midst of an attack on another girl, a woman he dragged out of the saloon and into a house. She began to scream, and the assault was interrupted by a police officer, John Bracken. Elgin launched at him with a knife, and he was shot by the officer and died the next day, which revealed the missing toe. There's also the fact that Elgin worked in close proximity to every crime scene, but most importantly, this last attempt that led to his death was just 2 months after his attacks on Christmas Eve, and after this, he never struck again, meaning it's more than likely that Elgin was the servant girl annihilator and not the same man that went to London 3 years later and became Jack the Ripper. Next, Sherwood Forest. Sherwood Forest is a play on the word Sherwood Forest and is a swamp located in Brick, New Jersey that is known for several white dress shirts hanging from trees for no discernible reason. It was first discovered on October 17, 1999, where 17 shirts were found hanging about 20 feet up, only to be outdone 12 days later when it was discovered 12 additional shirts were found hanging up. These shirts are often nailed or just draped over tree trunks and branches protruding from the swamp water. The shirts are weathered and are occasionally changed out or are laid out in a different arrangement. Interestingly, residents have tossed rocks or sticks at the shirts, only to hear a starchy cracking sound, like the shirts have been coated before they were hung up. There has never been an explanation as to who is doing it or why. The original Gurgles and Bugman image source. Gurgles and Bugman is a pretty popular creepypasta that began circulating around 2012, but that is not the focus of this mystery. Instead, it was the accompanying image that came with it, as you can see here. Apparently, no one knows where this came from, and this is a time well before AI, so it wasn't created with a generator. The image, which shows a doll-like face with pale skin, dark hair, and an open mouth dripping black fluid, can be traced back at least 5 years prior to the creepypasta, in a thread on eBombs World, with the specific date of October 12, 2007, with the file name dothing.uo6.jpg, suggesting that it was not created by that poster, and instead was just shared, meaning it had been circulating even earlier than that. To this day, there's no clear answer on its origin. Giant scale jellyfish, Leakesville. This one comes from a UFO blog called Lights in the Texas Sky, where it obviously takes in UFO reports from Texas and the South in general, and it records an incident from Lakesville, Mississippi on March 16, 2003, when a teacher walked outside and was stargazing, and she looked to the northeast and seen a huge jellyfish or squid object in the sky. She immediately knew that the object, which had 8 to 10 tentacles, was not man-made. The tentacles had lights going up and down on them, and they waved back and forth. She estimated that it was about 5 to 10 miles up in the sky. She would run in and get her friend, who also came out to look, and they observed a smaller craft flying in and out of the largest part. They would actually call the police and report it, but they were essentially laughed at. The jellyfish made no more maneuvers. It just kind of waved back and forth and sailed off into the distance right before the sun came out. Keel Secret Dinosaur Forest, Massachusetts. John Keel is a famous name in the world of paranormal research, and he's widely known for writing the Mothman prophecies, but he actually wrote about many cases of unexplained phenomena. In particular, many articles for Fate magazine. That's where this next one pops up, and he provides very little info. According to Keel, there is a forest in Massachusetts where people have been seeing dinosaurs. The huge creatures apparently get spotted occasionally before vanishing into the forest. where they cannot be found, leading Keel to suggest there could be some kind of time warp located there. Unfortunately, he didn't leave much more than that, leaving the dinosaur forest of Massachusetts as a sweet memory. Disappearing hallway. Next, we go to our favorite archived website, UFOfreeparanormal.com, and man, I really wish someone would buy this domain and relaunch it. Anyways, if you're not familiar, the site had a section of user-submitted stories where visitors could send in an email of their account, which was then posted to the web page. In this account, we got a story from a user of the site detailing her friend's account, who she listed under a fake name, Sarah. Now, Sarah, as a child, stayed in various hotels with her mother due to her mother's job, where she worked the night shift and got off at 3 or 4 in the morning. And it was on one of these late nights that Sarah was wandering around the hotel exploring when she came across an unusual spiral staircase. It closed by walls instead of railings. While going up, she bumped into a wall panel that moved as she fell into a dark hidden hallway. Luckily, the little girl would often carry a flashlight around the hotel, so she was able to use it to try and find her way out. And after about 10 minutes, she found a door, or panel, with light around it. As she pushed it open, and it led to the hotel's pool area. The staff seen her and ran over. They shut the door quickly and told her to never speak about what she had seen. Since they knew her though, they took her back to her mom's work area, and then the employees disappeared. Sarah would tell her mom the strange account, and they went back to the stairs to check, and there was no such movable panel in the wall, and hotel management and staff denied knowing anything about a secret hallway. She would later find out that the pool had actually been closed and chained off for over a year, making the whole story that much stranger. Encephalitis lethargica epidemic. This was an epidemic that is largely forgotten about and not really discussed much today, mainly because of the time it occurred, 1916 to 1930, which overlapped a time when another pandemic you may have heard of was occurring, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, which killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Encephalitis lethargica epidemic, or more commonly known as sleeping sickness, killed about 500,000 people over a much longer period of time, so it was much less deadly, but still more mysterious. Sleeping sickness was a neurological disorder that caused inflammation of the brain, leading to extreme sleepiness or lethargy, as well as movement disorders like tremors. Then there was psychiatric changes like psychosis, and in severe cases, coma or death. Patients would often appear to be frozen between sleep and wakefulness, like they were awake but unable to move, barely responding. It began during World War I, another reason it was overshadowed, as the cases first popped up in Austria and France. It didn't hit its peak until 1919 to 1926, when it would hit millions of people. About 1/3 of them would die, and another third of the survivors would develop Parkinson's-like syndrome, while there were even more survivors that were left in a complete frozen statue-like state for decades, fully conscious but completely immobile, only finding some relief in the 1960s when a neurologist, Dr. Oliver Sacks, created a Parkinson's drug that briefly awoke the patients after decades, which would be the story of the 1990 film called Awakenings. To this day though, no one knows where it came from or how it developed. There's some suggestions that it may have been linked to the 1918 Spanish flu, but how they were related is unclear. It could have also been an autoimmune response triggered by an infection, maybe from streptococcal bacteria. In either case, it disappeared in the 30s, although there have been rare times that similar infections have appeared, and when it does happen, it's studied closely, as researchers are still trying to figure out what caused sleeping sickness. Zodiac Killer was protected by authorities. This is a conspiracy theory which suggests that the authorities have known for a very long time the identity of one of the most infamous uncaptured serial killers ever, that of the Zodiac. It comes from a 2012 book called The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up: The Silenced Badge, written by former officer Lyndon E. Lafferty. Lafferty claimed that he was sitting in his patrol car at a rest area in 1970 when a man looking just like the Zodiac sketch parked right next to him. After the man left, he jotted down his license plate number, and soon the investigation began because Lafferty would research this man up until the book's release in 2012, but it wasn't just him. By the 1980s, a team of independent investigators, including retired officers and an ex-Navy intelligence officer, would help Lafferty with his investigation. In total, they found 156 circumstantial factors of evidence. Now, he wouldn't name the man obviously for fear of a lawsuit, but gave him a pseudonym, Tucker. Now, we obviously can't go over all of these, but we'll look at a couple. This Tucker apparently frequented a restaurant where one of the victims worked, Darlene Farron, and one witness gave a description of a car lurking outside Darlene's house, and that car was similar to Tucker's. Darlene's sister was also shown a picture of this man in 1987 and immediately identified him as the man stalking her sister when she worked as a waitress at a restaurant. Lafferty also claimed that the infamous cipher letters by the Zodiac spells out his own name. There's also many other little things, like him being in proximity to victims or crime scenes, as well as being in those areas around the time of the murders. In some cases, he had personal connections to the victim. So what was the motive and why the cover-up? According to Lafferty, Tucker was mad at the world after finding out that his wife was having affairs, and he wanted revenge. In particular, there was one of these affairs that led to the cover-up, a county superior court judge, who obviously didn't want the news of his own affair coming out, so he ordered law enforcement to stop investigating. Hyannis Sea Monster, 1897. September 1897, Hyannis, Massachusetts, would play home to this next obscure cryptid mystery, when the town's residents passing the shore would notice a strange and giant creature that had washed ashore from the ocean and into the mouth of a local creek. Hundreds of people were soon on site to look at and study the creature, yet no one could identify it. Soon a man named Theodore A. Drew, who was sort of a jack-of-all-trades inside town, would collect the skeleton, but first, he would take notes. He stated that it was a reptile, one that had never been seen on land or sea. He was grayish on its back, gradually shading to white on the sides and stomach. He was measured at 8 feet in length, although only 2.5 feet of that was body. Another 3 feet of that was neck and head, while the tail was 2.5 feet. The body was duck-shaped, and the thickest part was about 1 foot in diameter. Its long neck looked like that of a big snake, about 6 inches in thickness, while its head was long and flat, and about 8 inches across at its widest point. The tail was the weirdest part. It ended in a fleshly-like paddle, nearly 1 foot long and 6 inches across. The body had 4 flippers shaped like paddles of a seal, while the rear flippers were covered in a coarse hairy fringe. The lower jaw was missing, but the upper jaw showed no signs of teeth, meaning it was possible that this was a young creature. Before the skin was stripped off, it was found that the breastbone was shaped like a duck's. There were no scales. Instead, it was smooth like an eel. It was also discovered that the animal most likely swam near the surface, so it could poke its head out to breathe air. This is another one of those where the scholars at the time believed it was a plesiosaur, which were supposed to have went extinct millions of years ago. Fernvale Alien Invasion, 1927. When one thinks of strange UFO and alien encounters, rarely do we picture this happening before the year 1947, the year of the Roswell crash, and it's even more rare that we would see it happening in some out-of-the-way little town. But maybe even crazier, we would never picture Australia. But that's exactly where this next story begins, in the tiny town of Fernvale, in Queensland's Australia, back in 1927, nearly 30 years before Roswell. Our story begins on a ranch where witnesses observed aerial light phenomena 2 nights in a row, which greatly disturbed the cattle. On the 3rd night, the light did not appear, but the herd was terrified. But on the next morning, 3 dead cows were found, apparently due to being scared to death. Now the main problem with this story is, this all comes from one person that we do not know the real identity of. See, we get this story from UFO investigator Bill Chalker, who went and talked to this individual in the 1980s, and he would only give his account under the initial A, which automatically leads to doubt in the story. According to him, he was 10 years old at the time of these encounters. In any event, A would go on to report others in the area would spot an apparition, while 3 pigs were attacked. 2 died from neck wounds and puncture marks all over the body. The 3rd vanished and was never found, although a huge patch of blood and pig hair was found 150 yards away. A few nights later, A was awakened by strange noises and told his parents, who thought he was imagining things. But the noises returned the next night, and it woke them too, sending them out to investigate. They didn't see anything, but the following morning, they found tracks from a Wellington boot. They also noticed a strong smell of poultry and big feathers in the area. The nighttime visitations kept occurring, and A's older brother would see a flying object one night in the valley, one that lit up the whole area. The next day, the boys went to investigate and found scorched grass about 30 feet in diameter. After this, multiple people, including A, began to see a huge bird in the area. Then two of them, 3 to 4 times larger than most eagles. The weirdest part, though, would come at the end when the family would go to visit the neighbors and saw a stranger in a white suit who arrived, said nothing, and then disappeared into the darkness. Crazy story that can probably be attributed mostly to predator attacks and memory distortion. Hull werewolf. Werewolves are something we have not only discussed earlier in this video, but a few times throughout the series. One intriguing thing you may have noticed is there are hardly any werewolf stories from England. A lot of this comes from the fact that they were hunted to extinction inside the country, with the last official wolf being killed in 1390, which all comes from the fact that kings put bounties on the animal. Because of this, by the time the werewolf scare was hitting other parts of Europe, England never flinched. It wasn't actually until centuries later, in the 1800s, that England would finally get its own version of the werewolf, and even stranger, he still gets cited to this day. The Beast of Barmston Drain, also known as Old Stinker, has mainly been sighted in and around a town called Hull, but it's in 2016 that he would make his return, when women began to report Old Stinker had terrorized them. One woman specifically described the creature as being an 8-foot tall werewolf with a human face and very, very bad breath, while another witness reported seeing a half-man, half-dog. There were also claims that the animal stood upright for a moment before running off on all fours like a dog. Maybe the most frightening account, though, was the witness who claimed to have seen something tall and hairy jump over an 8-foot fence while carrying a German Shepherd in its jaws. Old Stinker, if you haven't figured it out, got the nickname because of its bad breath, but he was also frequently described as being hairy and having red eyes. Interestingly, there was even a werewolf hunt organized, yes, in 2016, although how serious they actually were is up for debate. As far as theories go, well, Skeptoid.com actually had an article about this very story and these alleged sightings, and what they found was quite surprising, or should I say, what they didn't find, which is, there's no records of Old Stinker or the Hull werewolf before the year 2015, meaning these stories about the creature's sightings in the 1800s were created in 2015, further meaning this whole story is nothing but a tall tale. However, the sightings of 2016 are legit, or most likely so, but these have simple explanations, like misidentification of common animals like dogs, deer, or foxes, maybe even an escaped exotic pet like a leopard. Winchester alien woman. This is another one we just don't have a lot of details on, and it seems like a one-off anyways. It happened in 2004, either late January or early February, and involved a city councillor from the city of Winchester in Hampshire, England, a man named Adrian Hicks. He stated that on a Saturday afternoon, around 1:30 p.m., he had just walked past a bookshop when he spotted what he thought was a pretty, yet strange, blonde woman in a white ballet outfit. She had very large prominent eyes and walked with a distinctive penguin-like gait and twirled her hands in a circular motion. He stated she was friendly, relaxed, and seemed to be enjoying herself, and that she seemed human enough to get away with it, but just strange enough the people turned around to look at her as if they knew she was an extraterrestrial. This shocked Hicks, but because of his career, he kept quiet, only coming out about the strange encounter 5 years later. He did state there were other witnesses, and he believes another woman snapped off some photos of the being, and he put out a request for more witnesses to come forward. He also stated he felt she was connected to a series of reports involving UFO lights seen in the area. Of course, no one ever came forward, and we're not exactly sure what it was that he did see. UFOs are constantly present but invisible. This one is a fringe theory presented in a book by John Keel called The Cosmic Question. In it, he states that light is made of tiny waves of energy, and red light has the longest wavelength, while violet has the shortest. However, there are other types of light we cannot see, like infrared, which is a longer wavelength than red, and we feel it as heat, while ultraviolet is a shorter wavelength than violet. With that knowledge, he brings up the fact that some UFO reports are described as appearing as a red or purple blob, which then shifts through colors, before finally becoming a solid-looking craft or fading out altogether, suggesting this happens because the crafts are moving from invisible wavelengths, like infrared or ultraviolet, to visible colors we can see, and then back to being invisible again. Basically, it's a theory that suggests UFOs change energy frequency so that sometimes we see them and sometimes we don't, but they're always flying in the skies. Furstenberg Medal. This one, there's hardly any info either, but it comes from a forum on a Polish humor site of all things. It was posted by a user who told a story of his grandfather being put into forced labor during World War II in Furstenberg. It was here he would work in an assembly plant, creating strange flat coatings made of light metal. He remarked that his grandfather was a technician and knew metallurgy, but had never came across this strange type of metal before, which was porous and kind of like flat sheets of metal sponge. The pores were made like a network of channels, as if they were to get resin injected into them. They were very brittle and light, but once injected, they become a flexible composite material. After the war, his grandfather tried to find where it was he was sent and what this metal was, but he found out there were not any metallurgical plants in Furstenberg, at least officially, leaving the mystery of what this strange metal actually was. And according to the comments, most point out the metal foams were indeed being explored then, starting with the earliest patents in the 1920s, but not seeing full development until 1956. But it's quite possible this was just early experimentation, probably to be used as lightweight structural panels, such as doors, and the records were all destroyed during or after the war, so there's no way to verify. Trilobite sightings. The trilobite is a long-time extinct arthropod, one of the earliest groups to appear on fossil records. It's one of the most successful of all early animals, living in the ocean for nearly 270 million years with over 22,000 species. But how could an animal that's been extinct for 250 million years become a mystery? Well, that goes back to cryptozoology. Although there has never been a sighting of this creature, obviously, in the 1960s, scientists did come across some fresh track marks on the ocean floor that looked like fossilized walking tracks left by the trilobite, which made some of them wonder, could a hidden trilobite still be alive? There was actually an attempt to put together an expedition to try and find whatever animal did leave it, but there was never enough funding, and the project fell through, and the animal was never identified. The Whistling at Night game. This involves a game from Vietnam associated with a superstition regarding whistling at night. Specifically, it said that if the game is performed correctly, it summons spirits or snakes into one's home. It can only be done with one person, and they bring out the main items like sweet biscuits on a plate with a candle and lighter, incense stick, joss paper, and a timekeeping device. One then ties a bell over a doorway and turns off the lights. Then, taking salt, you create a circle around yourself and light the candle. Right before midnight, you light the incense and hold it, catching ashes in a heat-proof dish. At exactly midnight, one needs only to whistle. It doesn't even have to be a song. If the bell does not ring, the ritual failed. If it does ring, it means it succeeded and a spirit will enter the room, one that you can allegedly interact with until the end of the ritual, either by extinguishing the incense or candle, stepping out of the circle, and removing the bell. Interestingly, there are variations of the whistling game across almost every culture. The mystery, I think, is some people really claim to have contact with spirits when they perform this, although the most likely reason the game exists ties back to parents just trying to get their kids to go to bed early. The non-dream dream. This one, we have to go back to the Internet archives and visit an old GeoCities page dedicated to the paranormal, known as Odawan. And on this page, they had a category dedicated to strange coincidences, which in turn were submitted by users to the site. Our mystery revolves around the narrator waking up to a table surrounded by very tall, thin beings. He would describe them as having large, bulbous heads, big black eyes, no visible mouths and noses. He didn't want to describe them as being the stereotypical greys, because he stated everything appeared to be a washed-out white and black color due to the lighting, but he could see that they were wearing luxurious silk-like robes and moved gracefully. He lay there while these beings inserted their long fingers into his abdomen and chest cavity, removing his internal organs and walking away with them, only to return and insert dark substances into his body. He then noticed another table with a being laying on it, stripped of its skin, and it's covered with a black caviar-like material. The narrator's organs are then placed into that body, while the black caviar substance is inserted into the dreamer's body. He starts to get the idea that they were trying to use his organs to save one of their own. That's when he would scream and wake up suddenly. He would immediately jump up and run to the bathroom, where he began vomiting dark flakes, resembling ash and burnt paper. This one is most likely a fanciful tale, or just a nightmare, but it doesn't explain the ash though. Jerry Marzinski theories. Dr. Jerry Marzinski is a psychotherapist with decades of experience working with psychotic and criminally insane individuals. He is on here as a mystery, not because he is a huge critic of Big Pharma, but because his beliefs revolving around schizophrenia. See, Dr. Marzinski believes voices heard by individuals with schizophrenia are not hallucinations. Instead, they're actual entities. In his observations of patients listening and talking to these voices, he realized they're having very coherent conversations, something not associated with hallucinations. So instead, he reasons that these people are not mentally ill. Instead, they have an ability to see these invisible beings and converse with them. In his research, he identified 20 specific patterns in patients that are contacted by these beings, and one is a constant. These spirits are always sending negative messages, most likely to control them easier. They always speak negative of religion as a way to isolate the person from God. He also noted the constant talking is a way to leave the patient exhausted. Dr. Marzinski further elaborates that Big Pharma pushes the biochemical imbalance explanation as a way to push highly toxic medication which does nothing to help. Instead, Dr. Marzinski has created his own treatment called MACE Energy Method, an energetic therapy that diffuses traumas by targeting thoughts, memories, and feelings to alleviate depression, anxiety, and PTSD, although he does admit it's not had great success with schizophrenia. So, yeah. JonBenet killed by a raccoon or coyote. Alright guys, let's wrap up this segment with a totally bizarre theory about one of America's most chilling, unsolved crimes, that of the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. All you guys know the story. It's been discussed and studied, maybe more than any modern crime to date. So I'm not going to hash out the details or other theories. You pretty much know what it is. JonBenet Ramsey was the 6-year-old child reported missing on Christmas 1996, only for her body to be found in the family's basement 7 hours later. She had been murdered. The case was surrounded by many things that made it a huge news story, like the family was wealthy for one thing. Another was the ransom note the law enforcement long suspected that the mother had wrote, not to mention the bizarre story itself that she was somehow missing in the basement that long, and her family just couldn't find her. Now I won't get into all the details on all the other theories and suspects, because again, you probably know that, but basically, there's two camps. Either an outsider got access to the home and done it, or someone inside that home did it. You'll find 3 theories in that one. Either the father, mother, or brother was responsible. However, this is the Obscure series, and this theory is obscure and crazy, and it suggests that, no, JonBenet Ramsey was not murdered. Instead, she was attacked by a wild animal that had accidentally got locked into the basement. One theory specifically suggests a raccoon or coyote got inside, but there's also other suggestions, like a bear or even something like an owl, that somehow snuck by the family, presumably because they had the door open. They then shut the door back, never knowing that the animal was inside, leaving it scared, and it panicked and discovered JonBenet Ramsey later on and attacked her. Of course, that doesn't explain how she was then bound up and strangled. or the ransom note. Although, I guess one could theorize that the family did all that to cover up for negligence. The fact that they somehow weren't able to detect a coyote that entered into their home and hung around for hours and then killed their child without alerting anyone, well, you could see where that might raise some eyebrows. However, this theory really seems to be a more intentional, ridiculous theory to mock those who insist that the killer came from outside the home. It's just a way to point out that the most obvious theory is someone inside the home is responsible. Te Puke Thunder. Te Puke Thunder is a legendary strain of cannabis hailing from Te Puke at the Bay of Plenty in North Island, New Zealand, that became famous sometime in the early 70s. It quickly gained the reputation for being one of the strongest and best tasting cannabis strains of all time, and has went on to become legendary, or you may even say mythical in status. This was due to the fact that it was a polyploid strain, meaning it had plant cells with 3 or more chromosomes, leading to larger buds and higher potency, which also meant it wasn't beginner friendly. It also benefited from the fact that it was grown in volcanic soil, along with it being in basically the perfect climate. Its reputation grew so much that it soon found itself popping up all over the world, most famously being sold in Amsterdam coffee shops. The mystery, however, is it disappeared, with law enforcement claiming that the strain has been basically eradicated. Some even claim no original seeds exist anymore, leading to many cannabis enthusiasts to search for them, or to even try and recreate the original with modern genetic engineering. This has led to many cannabis growers claiming that their crop is part of Te Puke Thunder's lineage, although these sellers have never been able to conclusively prove their plant is actually a descendant. So the mystery is, what happened to that strain? Or did it even exist? The Jester. The Jester is a pseudonym for an American gray hat hacktivist known for his self-directed cyber attacks he claims he does in patriotic defense of US interest. Although he presents himself as a hacktivist for good, some of his activities are seen as malicious. His stated goal, however, is obstructing lines of communication for terrorists or their sympathizers, fixers, facilitators, oppressive regimes, and other general bad guys. He also claims to be a former US soldier or possibly military contractor with ties to special operations experience. But again, none of that is confirmed. His name came to fame around 2010, as he has officially taken credit for, or sometimes been associated with, some of the more high-profile stories, such as the taking down of a Taliban website, his attacks on WikiLeaks during the document releases, but other things like Westboro Baptist Church and other Islamist propaganda sites. He even took credit for defacing Russia's ministry site, although those claims have been disputed. Cybersecurity experts have studied the Jester and his claims, and found that some of his deeds are probably exaggerated, or his legend online has kind of evolved to make him a bigger player than what he really is, leading to him being a controversial figure. But the real mystery is, what is his identity and motive? Train Defecator. Another small mystery roundup, another pooper. This time, in August 2006, a man went on a pooping campaign of terror in southeast England, where he would target trains. Yep, the man, described as exceptionally antisocial, that's one way to put it, would poop on at least 30 different trains, but probably more than that. He would always wait until he was alone and part of a carriage, and then proceed to start dumping, although he was spotted at least once by one passenger who made him stop. But it wasn't just the fact that he was dumping in these carriages. He would often take it and then smear it all over the cart. In total, he racked up cleaning bills of over 60,000 pounds, and in some cases, carriages had to be taken completely out of service, leading to disruptions and cancellations. He seemed to have no clear pattern of when he was going to attack either. It was just random. Although the man kept dumping new clues, police were never able to flush him out. Teraphim. When it comes to discussing the scripture of the Bible, there are numerous translations, variations, and arguments over what certain verses really mean. Heck, there are even certain words that we still don't actually know the meaning of, and one of these is the topic of our mystery. Teraphim, a word that is always conveyed as plural, yet might refer to singular objects as well. In the classic translations, it was often supposed to mean disgraceful things, although that's largely been dismissed by modern scholars. And if you pick up an English Bible now and look for the word's meaning, you'll find that it means idols or household gods or spirits. There were often little statues meant to protect one's home from evil. They are only mentioned in depth 3 times in the Bible, once in Genesis 31, when Rachel steals them from her father Laban when she is fleeing along with Jacob, then in Judges 17 through 18, when Micah keeps teraphim along with the shrine, and 1 Samuel 19, in which Michael uses the teraphim to fake David being sick in bed. From this, we know that in addition to safeguarding a home, they may have symbolized family, leadership, or property rights, and maybe were also used to seek guidance or predict the future. In either case, the Bible often treats them with disdain, since it would mean it accepts that there are other gods. However, what they really were has been lost to time. Tomb of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra is one of the most well-known love stories in the world, stemming from ancient Rome and its conquest of Egypt. A quick summary for those of you that don't know the story. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, Rome fell into chaos, and power was divided more or less between Mark Antony, Caesar's general, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Cleopatra at the time ruled Egypt, the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, and long story short, the two would meet and become lovers, and soon political partners. Octavian would use clever propaganda against Antony to have him portrayed as a traitor and declare war on him, a war which he eventually won. Antony fled, and thinking that Cleopatra died, fell on his own sword, and, mortally wounded, he was carried to see Cleopatra still alive, where he died in her arms. It is said that, rather than facing the thought of being paraded around in Rome as a trophy, she took her own life by intentionally getting bit by an asp, a very venomous snake. But the mystery is, where are their tombs? That is unknown. According to the Roman historian Plutarch, Mark Antony was buried with Cleopatra, and Cleopatra herself had already prepared a mausoleum near her palace in Alexandria. She gave instructions to have herself buried with Antony upon her death. However, that's never been found, and some speculate that this could be due to natural disasters such as earthquakes or tsunamis. There's even parts of the city that have sunken into the sea over the centuries. But there are new theories today that it may have never been in Alexandria at all, but instead in an ancient city called Taposiris Magna, which is about 30 miles west of Alexandria. A temple complex there was built which was dedicated to the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, and Cleopatra strongly associated herself with Isis, while Antony was often symbolically linked to Osiris. Not to mention, excavations here have uncovered coins with Cleopatra's image, along with several burial tunnels and chambers, just no tomb yet. Trophy of beheadings. Typically, I cover the unsolved murders more in depth, but in this case, due to the language barriers and a lack of details around the case, I decided to put it here. The Trofimov beheadings refers to a murder of a family in Kharkiv, Ukraine on December 15, 2012. The victims were 58-year-old Trofimov Sarayevich, his wife, 59-year-old Irina, the 30-year-old son, Trofimov, and his common-law wife, 28-year-old Zuiva Maria Irinova. What immediately jumps out of this case is the patriarch, 58-year-old Trofimov, was actually a judge. It all started when his adopted son went to the apartment but couldn't get in because the door was locked, and with no one answering his phone calls, he called the police. When they arrived, they found 4 victims at the scene. However, their heads were missing. Even darker was the son of the murder judge had actually been beheaded while still alive, while the other 3 victims had been killed with gunshots before they were beheaded. Neighbors were interviewed, and nobody reported hearing anything. Maybe most bizarrely, this all occurred on a federal holiday known as Court Workers' Day, which is obviously held in honor of anyone and everyone who works for the court system. The case has been one of the most extensively investigated in the history of Ukraine, involving several agencies, and including more than 30 forensic examinations. In total, 40,000 plus witnesses have been questioned, and over 800 experts have been brought in to examine the evidence, along with 60 plus CCTV recordings reviewed. And other than the conclusion that the crime was premeditated, nothing else has ever really been found. There's not even a motive, although later some of the victims' belongings were found in the Donetsk region, and some drug dealers were eventually detained for using coins from the victims' collection to pay for something. However, that led to a dead end, and one of the most infamous crimes in Europe still goes unsolved. Volcanic Winter of 536. The Volcanic Winter of 536 AD is one of the most severe cooling events to ever hit the Northern Hemisphere, thought to be caused by at least 3 massive volcanic eruptions which caused immediate global effects, such as darkened skies reported in Constantinople in March 536, along with the temperature which dropped about 4.5 degrees, only to get worse over the coming years, dropping down around 5 degrees below normal by 539 and 540. At first, that doesn't sound like much, but consider this: it led to crop failures, which in turn led to famine and the deaths of millions. Scholars from the time period left us notes about some of the other effects, which must have frightened the ancient mind, like Procopius, the Greek scholar, who recorded that the sun gave light without brightness, like everyone was living in a permanent eclipse, while Cassiodorus wrote that the sun's rays were weak and bluish, while no shadows were even seen at noon. He also recorded that the moon lost all of its splendor and the sun's heat was weak. The sky appeared cloudy and stretched like a hide, obscuring the sun and moon's full colors. In fact, Michael the Syrian, or Michael the Great, recorded that the sun barely shined for 1.5 years. Cassiodorus would go on to cite that there were winters without storms, springs without mildness, and summers without heat. They also suffered prolonged frost, droughts which ruined crops, and seasons that seemed to be jumbled. Meanwhile, in China, snow was reported in August, which caused the harvest to be delayed, while a dense dry fog hovered over the Middle East, while other Chinese records recorded a great cold in 536, along with yellow ash-like substance that fell from the sky. Other documents from the time period record that grain was extremely scarce, fetching 43 grams of gold for 1 piece. Kingdoms were forced to rely on stored food to survive, and modern research has basically confirmed that there were indeed at least 3 volcanic eruptions in 536 that really caused a massive disruption on Earth, followed by one within a decade that prolonged the suffering. Yet the mystery is, no one knows where the eruptions occurred, but recent studies seem to suggest that they most likely happened in North America, probably one near the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska, another one in eastern California, and finally, one in the Pacific Northwest. The 59th body at Lockerbie. December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 took off from London, England, bound for New York. When 30 minutes or so into the flight, the plane would explode over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing everyone on board, plus 11 people on the ground. It was one of the deadliest acts of air terrorism at the time, until 9/11 that is. It was also pulled off with one of the largest, most complex schemes the FBI ever investigated. Eventually, 2 men were charged with the plot: Abdel Bassett Ali al-Megra and Layman Khalifa Fima. The plot was traced back to the Libyan government, who formally accepted responsibility and agreed to pay the victims' families. However, it probably won't surprise you to learn that the deadliest terrorist attack in UK history is surrounded by conspiracies, from allegations of drug running to a mysterious white helicopter hovering above an orange tarp stretched across a field, concealing a large container, and inside that helicopter, a man leaned out the open door, gripping a machine gun as if he was standing guard. But our conspiracy revolves around the so-called 59th body. Upon seeing the crash on the news, a police surgeon named David Fieldhouse left his home immediately to begin helping in the recovery. Over the next day, he labeled and officially pronounced 59 people dead at the scene. When he went back the next day, his official report had been changed to 58 deaths. According to him, when he questioned his superiors about the change, he got no answer, and afterwards, the British government stole his notes and began an operation to smear him. This, of course, is all according to Fieldhouse himself, and it set off its own conspiracy. According to the theory, 2 loads of officials arrived at the scene the day after the crash, and many of these were plain-clothed Americans who wore no badge or had no obvious sign of who they were affiliated with. They unpacked their gear and mysteriously had 1 coffin with them, and one member of the parliament, a Scottish politician named Tam Dalio, would later hand over evidence which indicated that the Americans used this coffin to steal a body from the wreckage. However, who this was and why they did it assuming it really did happen, is unknown. The physics of the Kyle Odom shooting. This one is a conspiracy theory revolving around the Kyle Odom shooting, or maybe I should say, revolving around the alleged physics of that shooting. If you're not familiar with the story, it's a very sad one, fraught with mental illness. On March 6, 2016, a trained Marine named Kyle Odom, who was obsessed with alien conspiracy theories, approached Pastor Tim Remington from behind and fired 6 shots into his back, and 1 into his head, before fleeing the scene. The reason he done this, well, he believed Pastor Remington was hiding shape-shifting extraterrestrials within his congregation. But crazily enough, Remington survived, unbeknownst to Odom, who, by this point, had mailed his manifesto to media outlets, telling people about the alien conspiracy to enslave humanity. He then boarded a flight to DC, where he began tossing flash drives over the White House fence, as well as his manifesto. He was arrested pretty quickly. Meanwhile, Remington was taken to a hospital where he underwent several hours of surgery and lived. And I guess the conspiracy theorists just don't believe it. 6 shots from a .45, 1 in the lungs, and 1 in the skull at point-blank range, and he still survived. Well, it does seem pretty unbelievable, although I don't know what the conspiracy would be in trying to fake it. However, there's at least one study on .45 caliber gunshots and their survival rates, and surprisingly, they found that 2 rounds to the body had a survival rate of about 71%, which obviously would be lowered with 6 gunshots. However, gunshots to the head only survive about 10% of the time, so maybe it was just a miracle and not a conspiracy. Lottie, 2013, in the tiny Bavarian village of Eerie, a vacationing family would be greeted with horror when, taking in the beautiful weather, their 8-year-old son would come limping towards them from the lake. It looked bad. The boy's heel was bleeding profusely. The terrified parents quickly grabbed him, jumped in the vehicle, and headed towards the emergency room. The doctors quickly discovered his Achilles tendon had been severed, and they pretty much assumed the boy had been swimming in the lake and cut himself on broken glass. However, this is when things took an interesting turn. They looked at the wound closer and realized this had not been caused by glass. In fact, this was an animal bite, and a severe one at that. But what kind of creature could be hiding in this quiet and relaxing bathing lake at the foot of the Alps, a well-known tourist attraction? Well, no one was sure, so the doctor sent off the pictures of the wound to Munich Zoological Institute, which came back with a surprising answer. The bite was that of an alligator snapping turtle, and if you're not aware, those are only native to America, begging the question, how did it end up here? Well, that was easily answered, and it's almost certain that this turtle, which now earned the nickname Lottie, was an exotic pet that was released into the wild after the owner could no longer deal with its unpredictable predatory inclinations. Soon after the incident, the family left, unsurprisingly, but soon the small village was overwhelmed with journalists as well as adventure seekers who were determined to catch the beast. The town, meanwhile, offered a reward of the equivalent of about $1,300 US for anyone who could capture it. Well, that led to nothing, and the town had no choice but to pay to have the lake drained, as well as putting out traps, all to catch Lottie alive. However, it didn't work, as there was no sign of the turtle. However, it's important to note here that not only has the turtle never been caught, it's never actually been visually verified, which has led some to question if it ever existed in the first place. And if it didn't, then what in the world injured that kid's foot? The Bacanado thing. It was a late night in June of 2000 in the town of Bacanado, Chile, when security guard Luis Alberto Calavar was on duty, and his dogs began to bark frantically. Luis jumped up, grabbed his flashlight and a knife and ran outside. He began looking for what his dogs were barking at, and there it was, in his light, something he could not believe. He spotted a dark greenish form that ran very quickly. It seemed to Luis that it was climbing up a palm tree. While he was standing there watching the entity, his arm was suddenly hit with a weird cold sensation, causing him to drop his knife. His dogs, meanwhile, just stood very still. Luis then began to feel the numbness all over his body, which freaked him out, and he ran back to his security post, with the dogs following him, shaking in fear. He would hide there the rest of the night, later on reporting the incident and describing the creature as having a gelatinous body as if it was without a solid bone structure. and that it moved like a kangaroo. Luis stated that it stood over 4 feet tall and had floppy ears, as well as being covered in green hairs about 1.5 inches long. He would also note that when he first seen the creature, it was crouching behind a bush, and despite turning its body around, it never directly faced him. Now here's the odd part. Afterwards, Luis would go to see his doctor, who was stunned to see that Luis had somehow lost about 20 pounds, seemingly within a short amount of time after having this encounter, and the doctor had no explanation. Although, I have to point out here, there is a folklore/legend in South America about another creature that allegedly steals the fat of unsuspecting humans, so it's possible that this kinda got roped in with this encounter. Regardless, it would soon become known as the Bacanado thing, and there doesn't really seem to be an explanation, although it's most likely he just misidentified a known animal. Beijing giant rat. This one is a pretty obscure one, captured by the Web Archive, which gives an account from May 23, 1995, of 2 Chinese soldiers that allegedly captured a huge rat-like creature weighing 8 pounds that had paws like a cat and a tail as thick as a human's thumb. Allegedly, it was found by paramilitary armed police while on patrol on the outskirts of the capital. Now the problem with this account is, we just have so little information. First of all, it comes from a personal webpage that was hosted on the National Capital Free Net provider in Canada, which at the time offered dial-up internet, email, and web hosting. So many hobbyists would just make very primitive web pages. And since this person only stated that it had been reported by a Chinese news agency, we don't really have anything to go on, and I could not find any other articles about it. However, there are scattered reports from the mid-90s of unusually large rodents. In fact, in 1996, 1 year after this random account on this hobbyist page, the same news agency reported a 13-pound mouse that had been captured, but I could find no account of an 8-pound rat-like cryptid that the Chinese military captured. Flying car sightings. If you ever happen to look at old-timey predictions from the early 20th century, you will almost always see the flying automobiles that we're supposed to have now, and obviously don't. However, is it possible they once existed, or maybe just for 1 year at least? For some reason, in 1959, sightings of flying automobiles popped up all over the country, and it wasn't just an isolated thing. In fact, there were several reports, and on one occasion, a police representative of the Ohio Turnpike Patrol had to come out and tell citizens that these reports were just rumors. Thankfully, we do have a few of the more talked about accounts from that year. One involved a traveling salesman for a pharmaceutical company who reported seeing a driver step on the gas and the car began to fly a few feet off the ground as it passed a large truck, while a housewife in Pennsylvania would tell her husband that she had seen a car cruising along beside her with its tires off the ground by at least a foot. Her husband mocked her, of course, until at a neighborhood cookout that night, his best friend would tell the pair he had seen the same exact phenomenon himself, while a truck driver would tell a highway patrolman he had seen an automobile accelerate, rise several feet in the air, change its course in mid-air, land, and head in the opposite direction. He told the officer he did not take stimulants or any drugs either. Interestingly, although there are several accounts, the details are almost always the same. The vehicle was always one of 2 well-known models from 1959, and the car always took off and into the air when passing another vehicle, especially a big truck. However, there might be a simple answer. The most likely scenario is when these vehicles pass a large truck, they experience a suction caused by the disturbed air, and the car can be pulled laterally or even experience a sudden lift on one side. Not to mention, certain late 1950s models cars were boxy, high profile, and had light suspensions, which could make the whole car seem like it was being lifted, and a driver behind this might misinterpret what they're really seeing. Devon Rocket Man, 1990s. Taken from the book 40 Times It Happened to Me, we get a curious story from Devon, England. The woman that submitted the account, named Elaine, would recall that her and her husband were heading to a colleague's retirement party in the month of July, sometime in the late 90s. It was a warm summer evening as they sat with other guests chatting in the garden, when Elaine would happen to look up into the sky and see the dark shape of a figure of a man moving, upright, steadily, and silently across the sky, going east to west. She quickly looked at her husband, and he just looked at her and smiled, and nodded, acknowledging that he had seen it too. Amazingly, no other guest took notice, and Elaine began to wonder if this was something that just happened regularly enough that no one paid attention to it anymore. Once she left the party, she would of course talk to her husband about it, who also confirmed he had seen the same figure. It seemed to be wearing a backpack, yet had no obvious means of propulsion. There were no jets, wings, or a parachute. It just flew across the clear sky. They believed it was somewhere around 80 feet high. She also noted there was no balloon or any other debris in the area. Interestingly, her husband thought it was not mysterious at all, as he believed the military was just testing out a jetpack, although, again, neither of them saw any jet streams. As far as theories go, it was probably just pareidolia, and what the two really seen was an illusion. H.F. North's teleportation, 1953. 1953, a school teacher in Wellington, New Zealand, named H.F. North, would walk out of his home early one morning, headed to class, when the next thing he knew, he was walking through the streets of London, England. He had no idea how he had gotten there, and was completely perplexed and scared, like anyone would be. He tried to find help by walking to the nearest police station, where he told them he wanted to go home and he had no idea why he was in London, and this was not a hoax. The police contacted a psychiatrist who concluded the man had somehow gotten complete amnesia and could not remember anything from the time he had left Wellington till the time he landed in London. Interestingly though, authorities could never actually trace his movements, and it was also noted that it's unsure how he could even afford the ticket to get there, since it seems unlikely a schoolteacher who randomly got amnesia on his way to class probably had no thoughts of carrying enough cash for a flight to London. So it leaves the question, who paid for the ticket? Well, what if nobody did, and he somehow instantly teleported, and his amnesia was a result of that? However, the skeptical theory is just amnesia. Satan's Bridge. This bridge, located in the town of Ruffin, North Carolina, which sits near the border of Virginia, has become famous regionally due to some of the paranormal or satanic things that have played out here. The bridge is officially known as Bury Hill Bridge because it sits on Bury Hill Road. However, locally, it is simply known as Satan's Bridge, and it's actually became an unofficial tourist attraction, especially for content creators who specialize in the paranormal or urban exploration. Unfortunately, I was not able to find like one big story that revolves around it. Instead, just smaller accounts, usually taken from Facebook, that seem more like folklore. The bridge is, however, covered all over with graffiti, and a lot of that graffiti is pentagrams, and allegedly it goes back to a time that I was not able to find, although I would guess 1980s, when a satanic cult would get together and sacrifice animals here, and then hang them from the bridge, while other people have claimed to see hooded figures in the forest nearby. There are also other accounts which state murders have taken place here, along with some people who have taken their own lives. However, I can find no official source which actually states that, only Facebook talk. Others claim that ghosts have also been spotted, specifically that of soldiers from the Revolutionary War, since the original bridge traces back to those days, and there was a nearby hospital which serviced General Nathaniel Greene's army in 1781. Lord's Abomination. This next one, we go to the web archive and look at a now defunct website called ghoststudy.com, where, like a lot of these old sites, users would submit photos to the admin who would then post and discuss them. This one takes a look at a photo allegedly taken sometime around 2008 in Lourdes, Belgium. According to the admin, he received the photo with the note that there was no digital alteration made, and he himself had gotten the photo from a friend, and they were trying to explain what was wrong with this woman's face. As you can see here, the photo seems to be of two women who are sitting on some slow-moving ride, maybe at a park or zoo or some kind of tourist attraction. The woman on the right is our mystery, because her face is obscured by a dark, uneven mass, although the woman's hair, neck, and clothing are clearly visible, leaving one with an unsettling feeling. The admin of the website will go on to suggest it was a possible supernatural occurrence, meaning unseen beings managed to mark her face in some way that was only observable by film. He also suggests some kind of crude makeshift mask, or even Photoshop. However, the most likely scenario is there was just damage to the negative, some kind of chemical stain, or water damage, which could explain why the dark area doesn't look symmetrical like a precise mask would, and instead, it's somewhat rigid. Prince Philip's meeting with ethereal being Janus. In 2024, viewers were in for a treat when a new documentary was released called The King of UFOs, which takes a look at the British royal family's alleged interest in UFOs. There were many sort of surprising things discussed in this film, like the family's interest in crop circles, or the fact that Queen Elizabeth wanted access to the Vatican's secret archives to learn more about UFOs, or the one that King Charles owned a secret paranormal library to study UFOs, where he had a vast collection of files and books on the subject. But that isn't the one that everyone is talking about. In fact, that library that Charles has actually was inherited from his father, Prince Philip, whom was apparently obsessed with UFOs, and on one occasion, Prince Philip almost got to have a meeting with an alien named Janus. The story actually starts with Prince Philip's top 8 at the time, a man named Sir Peter Horsley, who apparently met this Janus in his flat in Chelsea in 1954. He would go on to claim that Janus had an ethereal, otherworldly quality and had the ability to read his mind and extract information about flying saucers. Now, of course, Sir Horsley knew that Prince Philip was big into UFOs, so he immediately went to tell him of the news and let him know that Janus wanted to meet him because he had a message to give him that the world needed saving, as Philip was a man of great vision. Although this Janus was only a 10-minute walk away, Philip would never meet him, in spite of the fact that this being knew so much about aliens and UFOs, or at least according to Horsley. Now you may be wondering why Philip, if he had such an interest, why he did not go meet with Janus. Well, I could not find an answer for that, but it seems like a lot of people think Janus was actually a Russian spy, and it's quite possible he was not allowed to go meet him. Gates of Hell. Did the Soviet Union accidentally open a portal to hell? The Darvaza gas crater, or known more by its touristy name, Gates of Hell, is a burning natural gas field burned into a cavern in Turkmenistan. What makes this mystery unique is we don't know exactly when it formed, nor do we know exactly what happened, although there are some common tales. Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, many records disappeared or got destroyed, so there's no real data that can back any of these claims. What is known is that this huge open pit of fire has burned for decades. The pit has a diameter of about 215 feet, and it is about 100 feet deep, and it glows like a massive spotlight in the desert at night, although there has been an effort in recent years to try and control it better. But back to its mysterious origin, the most widely told story is that the Soviets, in 1971, had began drilling the area to be used as an oil field, but it collapsed within days, forming the crater, which happened because they accidentally drilled down into a natural gas chamber, causing the cavern to collapse and swallowing the drilling rig with it. And because of the secrecy surrounding this, we don't even know if there were fatalities or not. The Soviet engineers, though, chose to set the gas ablaze to prevent the emission of poisonous gases into the atmosphere and causing health issues for the locals. However, they underestimated the volume of the gas. Now keep in mind, this is just one variation of the story, because there have been other people of note that dispute this claim. One is the local geologist from the time frame. They would come forward after the fall of the Soviet Union to claim that the collapse actually happened in the 60s and that the gas was allowed to escape up into the atmosphere, only for the Soviets to return 2 decades later in the 1980s and set it ablaze. However, neither of these stories can be confirmed, and no one is sure what set off the blaze that has burned for half a century. James Dean's Little Bastard. In spite of his short career in Hollywood, James Dean is remembered as a major figure in cinema from the 1950s. In his short 5 years, he left an impact in movies and pop culture, and in some ways, he became immortalized due to his death, that by a horrible car crash, a crash that some may have seen coming. In fact, Warner Brothers had barred Dean from racing at all since they felt it was too dangerous and they had a lot of money invested in him. Even an actor that had met Dean just a week prior to the accident, Alec Guinness, warned Dean that he was going to be killed in that car, that he felt it was sinister, and he predicted he would die in it within a week. Yet, Dean was a racer at heart, and he had actually scored some class wins in California road races with his 356 Speedster. However, on September 30th of 1955, he would drop his Porsche Speedster and buy a faster car, the Porsche 550 Spider, and Dean would nickname it Little Bastard. He would then set off on his way to a race that was taking place that weekend, followed by his friend, Bill Hickman, and a photographer. At 3:30 p.m., in what would become foreboding, Dean was stopped for speeding and given a ticket in Bakersfield. Just 2 hours later, traveling down the highway, a Ford sedan turned across the road in front of Dean, and the two hit almost head-on. Dean died almost instantly after suffering a broken neck and massive internal injuries. Everyone else survived. That is a story almost everyone knows, but you might not know the story of what happens to Little Bastard after this accident. Is it possible a car can be cursed? Interestingly, after the crash, the wreck was sold by the insurance company, and it was stripped down for parts. The transmission and suspension components were involved in another fatal racing accident, that of Dr. Troy McHenry. Then, we have two of the original vehicle's tires which were salvaged, and the new owner that got them would see them blow up simultaneously and cause him to careen off the road. Luckily, he did not get injured. And finally, the car's engine was used by a Dr. William Eric, who also crashed but survived. The mangled car's chassis and body were also sold. Its new owner loaned the wreckage to the National Safety Council, who would use it in a safety tour at car shows, road safety expos, and other public safety events. And in 1959, it mysteriously caught fire with minimal damage, and it was never explained. But it had another incident involving a truck driver who was transporting the body to one of these safety events when it accidentally fell off the truck and onto the driver, killing him. Finally, it was sent from Miami to LA in a sealed boxcar in 1960. However, when the train arrived, the boxcar was opened and the car was missing and never found, despite a $1 million reward for its recovery. However, some dispute this last part and claim that the owners now, the Eric family, created this part of the story to keep the legend going. Blarney Stone. What would you give to become a very elegant speaker, or someone who had the great ability to persuade people, or more commonly known as the gift of gab? Well, would you travel halfway across the world to Ireland to kiss a stone? If so, you're not alone, as nearly 500,000 people a year travel to a place known as Blarney Castle in Southern Ireland just to kiss a rock called the Blarney Stone, which allegedly has the power to grant one the gift of gab. And although there's not any confirmation that it really works, it has been visited by tons of celebrities, ranging from some of the best writers to world leaders, including Winston Churchill, as well as actors and singers like Mick Jagger. But why? How did this stone become affiliated with this strange power? Well, that is the mystery. For centuries, stories have revolved around the origin of the stone, with some claiming it was brought back from the Holy Land after the Crusades, while some claim it was taken from the same stones used in Stonehenge, or that it was a gift to the King of Scotland who defeated the English in 1314. However, all of those legends were ruled out in 2014 when geologists were able to conclusively rule that the stone was local to the area, which leaves us with a much more likely story. Sometime in the mid-16th century, Queen Elizabeth I requested Cormac McCarthy, the Lord of Blarney, to hand over his land rights to the crown. Cormac agreed, sorta. See, he actually told her he had no issues in handing over the land, but it might just take a little while. And every time the Queen followed up on her request, Cormac would always explain why the land couldn't be handed over at that exact time. He apparently was very persuasive and was excellent at stalling the crown. So much so that when the Queen received a letter from him in which he requested more time, she would throw it down, claiming, "Oh, he's just giving me more Blarney." And because of that, today, the word Blarney is synonymous with empty flattery. Although, another version of this tale claims that Cormac, who was not persuasive at all, was advised by a woman to kiss a certain stone that had the ability to make him persuasive, and he did so before he met the Queen, and he was able to talk her out of taking his land claim. And then of course that stone was taken back to the castle, where it remains to this day. With that explained, how did the legend start that this was some sort of magical stone worthy of a kiss from just anyone? That is much more difficult to discern. We do know that in 1888, American journalist William Henry Herbert wrote that the tradition was less than 100 years old, suggesting that it started sometime in 1788 or after. Yet, he never explains why or how it began. It just seemed to kind of happen, and eventually, it led to it being one of the most visited places in Ireland. Water elephant. The water elephant is one of those more plausible cryptid mysteries that we discuss from time to time. Allegedly, it is supposed to be a tapir-like animal that is semi-aquatic and lives in lakes and swamps in the Congo Basin. Rumors of the creature first began to pop up in the late 1800s as the interior of Africa was further explored. One key sighting was by a famous big game hunter, F.T. Pollock, who, in 1898, observed the animal but was unable to kill it. Pollock would also claim that an elephant hunter he knew, Henry Bailey, had sent a report to the Encyclopedia of Sport in 1911 documenting his sighting, but it was removed by the editor of the book, a zoologist, Richard Lydecker, since tapirs were not native to Africa. However, it would be in 1911 when the water elephant was put on the cryptid map, because a French naturalist named Charles Le Petit, who was affiliated with the Paris Natural History Museum, was exploring the Congo in 1907 when he spotted the animal. Since Le Petit was a respected man in his field, the report carried much more weight. He would describe it as a tapir-like creature that stood about 7 foot tall and had elephant traits. Its trunk was short, no longer than 2 foot, with a longer neck than modern elephants. Its body had smooth skin with no hair and was hippo-like, with ears slightly smaller than elephant ears, leaving tracks that had 4 hippo-like toes. It's this report that would find its way to a magazine called La Natura in 1911 that got scientists all around the world debating the legitimacy of this creature. By this point, Richard Lydecker, who originally disputed the creature's existence, became more open to the possibility and even supported the claim. More investigations would occur, and they found accounts from locals that suggested the creature was nocturnal, feeding on grass at night, spending its days submerged in the water like a hippo. It was known to capsize canoes and damage fishing gear. Yet, sightings were very rare. They got even more rare over the 20th century, with the latest major one recorded in 2002, when a Belgian helicopter crew saw strange elephants in Lake Tumba. There were talks of following this up with a more thorough search, but it never materialized. To this day, there is no physical evidence that shows that this creature really exists or ever existed. Whispers on Lake Yellowstone. This one is a case of unexplained phenomenon revolving around strange noises heard near Yellowstone and Shoshone Lakes. It's been documented since at least 1871, with the earliest by a man named Frank Bradley, part of the Hayden expedition, and he recorded hearing sounds that feel somewhere between a whistle and a horse whine that seem to be linked to air gust. In the time since, it has been heard by numerous people, some claiming it sounds like metal cables crashing against each other, or ethereal organ music, the sounds of ducks flying, or bee swarms, mechanical hums, sonar-like pings, even whale-like calls. No matter how it's described, the sound always appears to move through the air, growing louder and then fading, leaving people with goosebumps. There have been numerous studies over the past century to try and isolate the origin of the sound, with a 1930 Popular Science magazine claiming it was caused by mild earthquakes and underground caverns amplifying the sound. While in 1937, a ranger in the area claimed it was whirlwinds of air coming from nearby peaks. Of course, you also have those who claim it's ghosts or lost souls. Bor Jane Doe. June 29, 2003. A hunter in Bor, Czech Republic, was wandering through the forest near a highway when he suddenly came across a disturbing sight: the naked body of a heavily decomposed woman. The man quickly called authorities, who came to the scene and quickly were able to determine she had been deceased for several days, at least a week. Yet the mystery would be, who exactly was this individual? Well, that's why it makes it to this segment, because in the 2 decades plus, investigators have not gotten any closer to an answer. Of course, there were some minor clues and basic theories. For example, it's almost certain she was a foreigner and had been killed somewhere else and disposed of in this area. The medical examiner also noted that due to the muscles in her legs, she had never given birth, nor engaged in physical labor, played sports, and must have lived in an area that was completely flat. Other researchers concluded that she was most likely from the Caribbean, and her genetic traits revealed that she had features of Caucasian, Arab, and Indian. However, one thing that stuck out to investigators, and one key clue that should have led to some kind of conclusion, was her hairstyle. It was noted to be exotic and rare, with it being offered in only a handful of salons in the entire country, and costed about $400 US. It was Rasta braids made of synthetic canacolon fiber. However, the few stylists that did offer that haircut stated they did not remember seeing this woman. This led investigators to suggest she had actually came over the border from Germany. AXXO. If you are of a certain age, you will remember a time when streaming platforms were a rarity. That's right, before there was Prime and Netflix, you pretty much had cable and satellite, unless you were part of the pirate culture. Beginning in the early 2000s, websites began popping up which hosted torrents, essentially links that connected you to other people, called seeders, sharing a file, or files, often movies. Of course, the biggest was Pirate Bay, but there were many others as well. And in this era, when BitTorrents were very popular, an uploader would pop up who has went on to become a legend and mystery in the pirate community. The name was AXO, spelled lowercase a, uppercase XX, lowercase o. But what was so intriguing about this uploader? Well, between 2005 and 2009, he would upload numerous films, usually new ones, that become some of the widest shared movies in the BitTorrent community. In 2008 alone, one tracking firm found that he uploaded roughly 34% of all movies available online, an absolute staggering amount. Although he was basically a celebrity online, very little was known about him. He did grant at least one interview where he disclosed he was indeed one individual and not a shared account, and he had been ripping DVDs since he was a teenager. However, after becoming the most followed pirate online, in March 2009, he uploaded his last file. A month later, he would make his last known comment on a message board, and simply disappeared. To this day, no one knows who he was, and what he's doing now, or if he's even alive. Glowing Civil War wounds. The United States Civil War was a particularly brutal war, and in some ways, has left scars on the American psyche. Many times, wounded soldiers were left with one brutal option: amputation. When taking a shot to the leg or arm, the risk of the limb becoming gangrene was so severe that the soldiers would just have the appendage sawed off. But there is at least one occasion when something crazy happened, something you may say was a miracle. The Battle of Shiloh in 1862 was a devastating battle which saw the heavy losses for both the South and North, about 16,000 of these being wounded. But it's what happened on that night that would really mark a strange event in the Civil War, because as the soldiers hunkered down in the dark, they would look around at their injured comrades and see glowing wounds. That's right, these open and bleeding wounds emitted a greenish-blue light. In fact, all over the battlefield, there appeared to be human glow sticks laying around. That's not the only strange thing though. Because of the location, the mud and rain, and the sheer number of wounded, these men would lay there for 2 days waiting for medics. Yet, they survived, and both knights stared at their glowing wounds, which would soon earn the nickname Angel's Glow. And that's because the soldiers who had this glow seemed to heal much faster than the soldiers who did not have it. But what caused it? This would be a mystery for over a century, when in 2001, 2 high school students, Jonathan Curtis, along with Bill Martin and his mother, a microbiologist, went to the battlefield to investigate, and they would soon find what is the most plausible theory to this day: Photorhabdus luminescens, a bacteria which make their home within tiny parasitic worms in plants and soil. They glow a pale blue-green and also survive in cool, moist environments. They also vomit up bacteria to kill other microorganisms, so they don't have to share food sources. Basically, this bacteria that glows killed any harmful bacteria which might have infected wounds, but it had to take the exact right environmental conditions and right soil to make it happen, which is why it was such a rare event. Of course, without actually being able to study the wounds themselves, this will always just be a theory. Sunk by a sea monster. September 4th, 1879, the Norwegian ship Columbia, commanded by Captain L.C. Larsen, was en route from London to Quebec, intent on picking up some cargo. The ship was older, but was moving about 7 miles per hour when, at 10:30 a.m., bam, the ship experienced a sudden shock. Captain Larsen, along with the first mate, H. Peterson, ran out onto the deck to see what the ship had struck. Was it a rock? An iceberg? Well, what they seen was an even bigger surprise. All around the ship in the water was blood, along with a massive creature about 50 feet long that continued to thrash about. At first, the men reasonably assumed that it was a whale, but the back had an unusual curve, while its tail was enormous, and its fins did not seem to indicate a whale. However, they had little time to concentrate on it, because the collision had crushed several planks in the bow, creating a 4-foot wide hole, 3 feet below the waterline, and the ship began taking on water. They tried to block the flooding, but it was no use. Captain Larsen ordered the men to abandon ship, and 2 longboats were lowered, taking only the essential items, like the ship's logbook, navigation instruments, some clothing, and fresh water. About an hour and a half later, the Columbia sunk. Luckily for the crew, later that afternoon, the Dutch steamer SS Piekeland came up, as it had seen their distress signal earlier. Captain Larsen would tell the crew that they had encountered an unknown sea monster. As soon as the men reached back to shore and told their story, it spread like wildfire through the press, with claims that the men had seen some kind of large sea serpent. Of course, skeptics of the time, and now, claimed it was nothing more than a whale, probably a humpback or sperm whale. Yet the issue was, these were all veteran sailors who had seen many whales in their time on the seas, and they were all united in their belief that it was definitely not a whale, and that's a view they would keep for the rest of their lives. Lake voices and the terrified divers. This one refers to a common theme from accounts of deep sea divers who have claimed to have heard voices way beneath the waves, with many of them coming back to the top, babbling incoherently and obviously terrified, with even some accounts claiming that divers returned and told a story of hearing a voice that said, "If you fathom me, I will swallow you." These stories have been told as long as man has had the ability to actually do deep dives, although they have varied somewhat. For example, Lake Seefeld, now known as Wildsee, a lake in Austria, has an account of divers hearing a voice that states, "If you sound the lake, I will engulf the entire city of Seefeld." However, the most likely theory for all these stories is nitrogen narcosis, also known as rapture of the deep. It's when increased partial pressures of nitrogen impair the brain, causing auditory and visual hallucinations, leaving many divers to suddenly feel like they are hearing or seeing things, and it will also elicit strong emotional reactions. Eastbourne Sewer Zombie, 2008. 2008, Eastbourne, East Sussex, England. A manager at the Southern Water Treatment Plant would get an odd request from one of his employees. It seems Mark Way, a sewage treatment worker, wanted permission to hire a paranormal investigator to look into the allegation that the sewers were haunted. According to Mark, many of the employees had become too frightened to do their job because they noticed upon entering the tunnel they were being followed by a humanoid figure. In fact, the paranormal investigator tasked with this job stated that it seemed to be one specific area of the tunnel that this always occurred, a place where the employees seen and felt things. He would go on to conclude that while he couldn't say for sure if it was truly haunted by spirits or because of the presence of strong electromagnetic fields, which can give the illusion of being haunted, that there was definitely an eerie sense of paranormal activity detected, and that many of the employees interviewed reported hearing muffled conversations following them around, as well as a laugh that seemed directed at the staff. However, the most likely theory on this one? Poor air quality. The sewers can produce hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon monoxide, and other gases that can cause dizziness. hallucinations, and the feeling of being watched. What Lovecraft saw in the swamp that night. This one is super obscure and comes from a 1995 edition of the Macon Telegraph, a newspaper publication in Georgia. In the section where letters to the paper are printed, came a note from a man who signed as Clifford Eddy. He would go on to write that his mother, Muriel Eddy, was an author, along with his father, Clifford Martin Eddy. Now his father is the main part of this mystery, because he was good friends with an author named H.P. Lovecraft, whom he co-authored some stories with. But the mystery that Clifford was writing into the paper about was an account where his father had gone with him. Apparently, him and H.P. Lovecraft, who was a night owl, would often walk at midnight through Chinatown, and one night in 1922 or 1923, him and Clifford decided to go out into the woods of what they called the Great Swamp of Chepachet, Rhode Island, because they had heard that it had been seen there. This it was supposedly a ghost or monster or something like that. Whether they actually seen it is debatable, but apparently neither man would ever talk about that night again for the rest of their lives, which has led to the question, what did Lovecraft see in the swamp that night? The Talking Tomcat. This one comes from a 1997 book called Strange But True, a collection of true stories from the Files of Fate magazine. The stories are from the readers of the magazine and offer first-hand accounts of unexplained phenomena, and this one came from a woman named Barbara Healy, who would tell of growing up in North Georgia, and at the age of 9, while waiting on a school bus one morning, a large yellow tomcat would walk right past her and sit on the porch. When she got home that evening, the cat was still sitting there in the same exact spot. She would go inside and get him some food and would soon name him Tom. Now this was perfect timing, because she and her family were about to move to the country just a week later, and she would take Tom with her. She would go on to talk about how gentle he was, but was also very defensive, referencing when her and her mother would take night walks, Tom would go a few feet ahead of them, only stopping when they did, even following Barbara when she sleptwalked. She would bring up times that the cat would defend her from snakes, rats, and even one German Shepherd. But the craziest moment was when she would hear strange noises, like voices, coming from the basement, and Tom would stand at the door growling, with his hair standing on end. Her father opened the door and the voices got louder. He would yell down that he had a gun, although he didn't. But Tom walked on around him, crouched, and growled into the dark as he made his way on down the stairs, stopping halfway down, and when he stopped, the voices did too. And then it happened. Tom's growling noises began to morph, and it sounded like he said, "Get out. No, I won't let you. No, I won't do it." This terrified her father, who was standing behind Tom, and he would call to him. But Tom turned around, with green eyes glowing and claws out, and jumped straight into her father's chest. He would scream and threw him to the side. The rest of the night, Tom slept in front of the basement door, guarding, but she did note the basement had a small room filled to the ceiling with soil, something she was always curious about. She would close the letter by stating that she had left 4 years later, and then her parents moved out, and they never seen Tom again, leaving the question as to if Tom really talked. Bigfoot is a giant sloth. Here we go again, another Bigfoot theory. Ground sloths were a very real animal that has long been extinct, maybe around 10,000 years ago or so. They were large, hairy ground-dwelling mammals kin to anteaters and tree sloths, and although they are extinct, they are also a cryptid, because some cryptozoologists claim that a tiny population of giant sloths still exist, and some of this is based on accounts by Native Americans. See, the Micmac people of Nova Scotia have a legend passed down from their ancestors to tell of a village that was once plagued by giant squirrels that destroyed their bark teepees, but their descriptions, large, furry, and feeding on bark and vegetation, and standing upright, is pretty similar to a giant sloth. The catch is, Micmac legends go no further back than 500 AD, suggesting that the giant sloth could have still been around at that time. While another tribe in the Yukon, the Northern Tutchwan, have a cryptid called Saitochin, a massive animal that feeds on beaver lodges. Modern-day research on this led to interviews with the Northern Tutchwan, and upon being shown a picture of the giant sloth, They identified it as the Saitochin. They would even make a claim that in the late 80s, this same creature visited, which led to the theory that giant sloths are still in the remote wilderness of the Yukon. Okay, so I had to explain that part before I could get to this crazy theory, which is these ground sloths could account for some Sasquatch sightings. I know, your mind is blown, but evidence for this theory goes back to the fact that ground sloths could stand upright, resemble bear-like humanoids, and could also have an overwhelming odor, which sounds a lot like Bigfoot. Of course, that whole theory is kinda disrespectful to Sasquatch. Senoria Monaro. Senoria Monaro is a woman involved in a very bizarre case of unexplained phenomenon in 1934, only made stranger by the fact we know so little about it, drawing our information from a few Italian newspapers. Monaro was a patient at Pirano Hospital in Trieste when nurses observed that flashes of light would emanate from her breast in intervals, glowing briefly before fading. It was reported to have happened multiple times during the night when she slept, bright enough to light up the entire room. She soon gained the moniker Electric Woman. It got the attention of numerous doctors across Europe, which led to more investigation. There was even a group of students from Harvard Medical School who wished to study the case, but they stayed anonymous due to the fact so many people were connecting it to the supernatural. Maybe the best confirmation of the whole strange affair, though, was Marconi, the famous inventor, who stated there was no doubt about the authenticity of the report. Granted, it doesn't say if he went to investigate himself. Regardless, it seems like the doctors never got their answers, and there's little in the way of information for this one. However, if you watch the Obscure series, you might remember a similar case we discussed back on part 14 with a woman named Maria Gerardi. Her case happened 3 years prior and in Slovenia, and just like in this case, no one could ever explain why it was occurring. Turkish sheep mass jump. In July 2005, a bizarre incident occurred in Yavuz, Turkey, where nearly 1,500 sheep jumped off a nearly 50 feet cliff in what was described as a mass ending their life. The chain reaction began when one sheep fell, prompting the rest of the flock to follow. About 450 sheep died immediately, while the remaining animals, about 1,100, were cushioned by the pile of carcasses and survived. Unfortunately, the shepherds were away eating breakfast when this all happened, although I'm unsure if they could have stopped it anyways. The sheep belonged to 26 local families, each previously owning around 20 of them, with a total financial loss estimated to be around $100,000 US, which, for perspective, the average income of a family there is about $2,700 a year. The incident illustrates herd behavior, which is not unique to sheep. Animals such as chickens, dogs, and cats often follow group cues, sometimes abandoning resources they already have for uncertain rewards. Yet, it's still a mystery. Fanshang Twin Phenomenon. In the mountains of Hubei, China, there is a village that has drawn attention for one unusual reason: an extraordinary number of twins. In Fanshang Village, just 50 households in this small community have produced 16 sets of twins over the past 50 years. That means twins are appearing at a rate far above the global average, and the pattern has made the small community something of a local curiosity. Villagers have long pointed to the same explanation: the water. Many believe the old village well has played a role in the unusually high number of twin births. For years, mothers in the village have drank from that well, and locals say the connection is too strong to ignore. Of the 16 sets of twins, 9 are sisters, 4 are brothers, and the rest are mixed pairs. The oldest are now 51, while the youngest are just 5. In a place this small, that many twins is impossible to miss, and even neighbors and parents have said it is difficult to tell some of the identical pairs apart. The village is informally known as Twin Town, and the reputation has spread well beyond the area. Some residents remain convinced the well water is behind it, while others say genetics is the more likely explanation. What did Lillian Carney see? On August 8, 1897, 6-year-old Lillian Carney accompanied her parents into the woods near Masardis, Maine, to pick blueberries in an area known as Mullen Bog. Surrounded by dense forest and remote terrain, the outing was routine until Lillian wandered out of sight. At first, Her parents searched for her on their own, calling her name and combing the nearby brush. When an hour passed with no sign of her, word spread quickly. By that evening, a growing number of locals joined the effort, searching until midnight. The following morning, around 200 people returned to the woods, moving through the area methodically, but no trace of the child was found. Family members and volunteers remained in the forest overnight though. By Tuesday morning, the search had expanded to roughly 300 men, and around 10 a.m., a local resident named Bert Poland discovered Lillian about 2 to 3 miles from where she had been last seen. She was alive, calm, and asking for her mother. In her hands were wild berries. Though she reportedly refused to eat them, signals were sent out immediately to announce that she had been found, such as firing a gun into the air. When questioned, Lillian would give a brief account of her time in the woods. She said she had heard people searching, but stayed hidden because she believed they might be, quote, tramps. She also mentioned seeing small creatures about the size of her cat and said she had clapped to scare them away. One statement stood out in particular though. She said that the sun had been shining the entire time that she was in the woods. That strange account comes from a single article of a local 1897 newspaper, but it's what came out nearly 90 years later that made it famous today, because in 1986, Bert Poland's great-grandson shared a handwritten note said to have been written by Bert the night that Lillian was found. According to that account, Lillian had been wearing a cape made of fur and a crown of flowers when she was discovered. She was described as being slightly dazed and spoke about wanting to return to her friends, who treated her like a princess. She also referred to, quote, hairy people, and said they had sunlight in their eyes. This has led some cryptozoologists to suggest she had a Sasquatch encounter, but it was most likely the kid's imagination. Guelph John Doe. This one, I could barely find any info. The Guelph John Doe, or sometimes referred to as Wellington County John Doe, is an unidentified man whose skeletal remains were discovered in a shallow grave along a county road in Puslinch Township, Ontario, in 1970. He's believed to have died decades earlier though, likely sometime between the 1940s and 1950s. The man was middle-aged and suffered from severe osteoarthritis in his lower spine, a condition that would have likely caused chronic pain. Despite this, his teeth were in excellent condition, showing notable wear but overall good dental health. Only fragments of clothing remained, including pieces of fabric believed to be from a white shirt and white socks, along with several buttons. However, a number of personal items were recovered that provide insight into his appearance and lifestyle. That includes a gray fedora bearing the initials J.U. and the names Calhoun's and Bathersby, which were both inside the hat band. There was also a leather belt with a steer's head buckle and half-soled Oxford shoes. Additional items found near the remains were a yellow carpenter's pencil and a tin eyeglasses case, suggesting he may have worked in a trade or required glasses. 6 coins, both Canadian and American, dated between 1936 and 1945, were also recovered. Despite these clues, his identity has never been determined. Chicago, February 26, 2007. A man was brought to the hospital after suffering a stroke. He survived, but the damage was severe. So severe, he could no longer remember who he was. For years, he has lived under state care, relying on staff and volunteers to help navigate a world that feels unfamiliar. He carries a red folder, filling it with notes he hopes one day will spark his memory. Inside is a homemade card, either from a son he believes he has, or to give to a son he hopes he has. He goes by Shannon Knight, though over the years, he has used many names. Shannon Knight, Shannon Haight, Sanane, Sanae, even the street name, Vino. Arrest records confirm he existed under these aliases, but none of them have revealed his true identity. He believes he was born in November of 1976. Before the stroke, he lived at the Salvation Army homeless shelter in Chicago. Photographs from his younger years and mugshots from the late 1990s have been shared publicly. Some who saw them remembered playing basketball with him, though these witnesses cannot remember his name either. There is some discussion that his tattoos possibly connect to certain neighborhoods or even gangs, but Despite all of this, even with all of his arrests and people that knew him, nobody knows his real name. Christopher Carlton Tompkins, January 25th, 2002, Ellerslie, Georgia. 20-year-old Christopher Carlton Tompkins would leave his home around 8:10 a.m. to head off to his job as a surveyor. He parked his car at the office and rode with a co-worker to a job site, a lightly wooded area off of a county road. He was part of a 4-man survey crew working in a lightly wooded area, which seen the men move in a line spaced about 50 feet apart, with Christopher at the end. Sometime after lunch, around noon or shortly after 1 p.m., depending on the source, Christopher was talking with one of the other co-workers. That worker would briefly turn away to complete a task, and when he looked back, Christopher was gone. No one reported hearing a scream, a shout for help, or anything like that. When the crew searched the area, they found Christopher's work tools on the ground, along with one of his boots hanging from a barbed wire fence. Nearby, they found a blue piece of fabric from his pants and 12 cents on the ground. Christopher's other boot was not found until 5 months later, when a property owner discovered it on his land right next to a highway, less than a mile from where he had disappeared. Christopher's mother was not told right away. She said she was only informed later that afternoon, between 4 and 5 p.m., after the crew had already spent hours trying to locate him. Family and friends searched the area that evening, and again the next morning, but they did not find Christopher. Police, and later the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, would also search the area, including nearby ponds and lakes, and used cadaver dogs. No body was ever found, and no clear evidence explained what had happened to him. Now you might be wondering why I put this case in the Small Mystery Roundup, because it's a pretty well-known case, all over the Unsolved Mystery blogs and on YouTube, but the problem is, there's just not much info with it. It's definitely one of the most bizarre disappearances in the modern age, and according to some, that might be due to Christopher's co-workers, or a lazy police investigation, or a mix of both. But in researching the case, I found that it's pretty straightforward and well documented, which makes it creepier. Today, most internet sleuths point the finger at one or more of his co-workers, although it's unclear if detectives ever really investigated them. There's also the possibility he became frightened for some reason, maybe panic in the woods phenomenon, and then he took off running and got injured or became lost and died due to the elements. The lost city of the monkey god. In the dense rainforest of eastern Honduras, stories about a hidden white city have circulated for centuries. Travelers, explorers, and local people all passed along versions of the same tale. Somewhere in La Mosquitia, beyond the rivers and mountains, there were ruins no one had properly reached in modern times. For years, the jungle kept these stories out of reach. The region is enormous, remote, and difficult to cross. The thick canopy blocks the ground from view, and the terrain makes surveying nearly impossible. But that changed when researchers began using LiDAR, a laser mapping technology that can reveal the shape of the land beneath the trees. From the air, the survey showed something remarkable. Beneath the forest cover were plazas, earthworks, mounds, and an earthen pyramid. Archaeologists later confirmed that the site held a cache of stone sculptures as well, left in place and apparently untouched for centuries. The area appeared to have been occupied by a culture that flourished there about 1,000 years ago and then disappeared from view. The discovery drew immediate attention because it came from a region long tied to a legend called the White City, sometimes called the City of the Monkey God. But the site was more complicated than the legend. It was not a single dramatic ruin rising out of nowhere. It was part of a wider archaeological landscape, one that had barely been studied and was still poorly understood. This is part of what makes the mystery so interesting. The people who built these settlements were not the Mayans, and archaeologists still do not even have a name for their culture. The remains point to a society with public spaces, ritual objects, and planned architecture, but so much about it remains unknown. Who they were, how they lived, and why the settlements were abandoned is still unknown. We start with the New Zealand Phantom Submarine. This is one we have already covered on the Mega series, and it's fairly small, so I'll just sum it up again. September 13th, 2012, Auckland, New Zealand. A harbor worker named Brad Watson would spot something that got him kinda curious. He would quickly reach for his phone and snap the tail end of what looked like a long sleek craft ghosting along the waterfront at around 11:30 a.m. This photo, believed to be a submarine, was looked at by the New Zealand Coast Guard, who had no idea what it was. It was only made odder by the fact that it took place in front of the Viaduct Harbour, the busiest neighbourhood in Auckland, and no one else reported seeing it. 360 Discover Cruises, which runs through the area, looked at the picture and could not identify it. Neither could the people who worked on the harbour every day. One employee, who spent most of the day on the harbour bridge, would say she had not seen anything unusual, and insisted she would have heard about it if something like this really had occurred. Leaving the question, what did Bill Watson really snap a photograph of? And if it was a submarine, who did it come from? Russia? China? Or is this just some elaborate hoax and Brad fell for it? Or was Brad behind it himself? Cat hair on Mars. February 18th, 2021. The Mars rover, Perseverance, would touch down on the neighboring red planet, with one of the main stated objectives being the search for past life on Mars. And in 2022, they found something that might just indicate that. In a NASA blog post, they would explain how they often take photos of all the tools after completion of a task to make sure everything is in working order. And on this occasion, actually, it was on the 12th sample taken by the rover, the team would take images of a drill and, to their surprise, found something on it that resembled a cat hair. That's right, 2 small pieces of unidentifiable debris were found. One, a small object on the coring bit, and then the other was this little cat hair-like object, which was on the drill chuck. To this day, nobody knows what the debris was. FWD-7, an internet meme essentially. FWD-7 pops up on various mystery icebergs, and no one seems to know what it is. Some YouTubers say it is a story relating to an email and a potential dead body, but really, I think it was just some iceberg creators' attempt to troll some YouTubers, and then other iceberg creators just put it on there, not knowing what it is. The Tin Man Mystery. The Tin Man Mystery is an elaborate alternate reality game built around a series of cryptic videos, hidden messages, and coded clues. It centers on a figure, called Tin Man, obviously, who delivers puzzles via YouTube videos, featuring manipulated audio, numerical codes, and ciphers. Early clues hinted at themes of sacrifice, deception, and control, with later videos escalating in complexity. One of these was a hidden video called The Pin, which showed a distressed woman behind bars with the spectrogram message, "My Sacrifice," suggesting the outcome of the game may have real consequences within the narrative. From what I can find, it got its start on X, the paranormal board of 4chan. Odd Goggy, a cryptid, or more like a Scottish folklore, that is supposed to be a giant hairy caterpillar, said to live in orchards and forests protecting ripe fruit. They target disobedient children, and they are often able to swallow them whole. It was more or less a boogeyman type story used to get children to behave, or to keep them from wandering alone into the forest. History before the French Revolution is fake. This one is a common pseudo-historical conspiracy, which suggests that all history, or at least some of the history, before the French Revolution is entirely fake. Depending on where you read this one, it could be something like the ancient Egyptian empire was exaggerated or fabricated by later historians. Others suggest that certain kings, emperors, or religious leaders were altered to create an illusion of continuity and divine right. That way, they would appear to be more legitimate and could set the stage for revolutionary changes that came in the late 18th century. And then there's the Dark Ages, that weren't so dark after all, but allegedly was this period of political upheaval that was later misrepresented by historians to justify the Age of Enlightenment, while possibly suppressing certain types of ancient knowledge. All in all, I think it's more of a meme theory than anything else. Numbers on esophagus. This is a small medical mystery found on the subreddit Ask a Doctor, and there's not a lot of info or follow-up on it. Even the original poster only gives 3 sentences about the mystery, which is basically, this person had a friend that had a GI scope procedure, or gastrointestinal endoscopy, after a number of years of bad acid reflux. and on this person's esophagus was apparently numbers, and his doctor could not explain it. The theories presented in the thread, since I could not find them anywhere else, speculated the most likely scenario was that a pill or capsule the person took left an imprint on the esophageal lining, which was then reflected as numbers and letters due to taking the medicine without enough water during the pre-procedure fast. Another person suggested that the numbers were not on the esophagus at all, but instead were inadvertently transferred from the procedure chart onto the image of the esophagus, although the original poster would comment in the replies that the doctor had ruled that out. Finally, in some procedures, like removing a cancerous polyp, tattooing can be used to make a spot in case a surgeon ever has to operate in that area again. It can also be used just for future reference. The problem with this theory was that the original poster claimed his friend, a 42-year-old male, had never had a procedure done before. And that's pretty much it. Toad King, 1979, in the Bryansk region of Russia. Several eyewitnesses would come across an unbelievable cryptid sighting. Apparently, these people would claim to have come upon huge toads, which stood on their hind legs, propping themselves up on trees. There were 3 of them, with the smallest being over 2 feet in size, while the largest was about 3.5 feet in size. They also had these growths on their head, which apparently records note that some peasants would take them as fossils way back in the old days. These appendages were more like a bony plate you would see on a turtle's back, and that the creatures also had scales on their body. They also possessed thin fangs in their mouths, 2 on top and 2 on bottom, and their webbed feet also possessed claws. Surprisingly, their eyes were more snake-like than toad, with the pupil located vertically. One of the witnesses, for some reason, decided to throw a stick at the creature, but this animal, whatever it was, smashed it away with a sharp movement. Then the 3 toads moved back towards the swamp, moving on their hind legs, but when they sped up, it appeared like they weren't using their legs. Interestingly, around this time, a woman reported seeing a huge snake in the area, sorta like a boa constrictor. This was apparently the only sighting of this cryptid that would become known as Toad King. None of the witnesses who originally reported it in 1979 could be found for a follow-up. The theories are, it's just folklore, and no real witness accounts of an alleged Toad King actually exist. Another theory is just misidentification of another animal or some kind of toad that had a rare genetic mutation. The discipline of a psychic warrior. What do the following topics have in common? The Panama Canal, wife beating, bank robbery defense, and prison farms. If you guessed topics in a strange obscure book whose author is unknown, then you are a genius, because that's exactly what it is. The mysterious book is known as The Discipline of a Psychic Warrior, and although it came to prominence on the obscure media scene in 2021 after being rediscovered, it was actually published in 1978, and I already went over just a few of the topics, but it is actually more bizarre than you think. There's chapters dedicated to the do's and don'ts of professional boxing, team boxing, carpooling, and modern revisions of the Lord's Prayer. Opening the book to the first page also reveals the copyright, which says all rights reserved by the Foundation. And following the table of contents is the message which reads, "This book is dedicated to those who will suffer and die in the struggle to save our planet." And the book, as you might imagine, is not one of the traditional variety. Instead, it's just a collection of letters the writer has saved up over the years. Letters that he sent to various newspapers, specifically the Boston Globe, but also journalists, TV networks, politicians, sports organizations, and doctors. Furthermore, although the book does not have an author listed, the lost media community was quickly able to find the man, and his name was Ralph Paulson, who wrote another bizarre survivalist text known as The Rebuilding of God. Ralph had apparently spent years sending letters about anti-capitalist themes and survivalism to various media, where he suggested some of the craziest ideas, like injecting whales with radioactive material to save them, or having basic sexual training and IQ enhancement achieved by hypnosis. But who was Ralph? Well, the lost media community has worked on that too. He was most likely from Massachusetts, or maybe New Hampshire. and he had been a swimmer at Tufts University. He also went to Brockton High School in the late 60s and most likely wrote the letters in his late 20s during the time of Vietnam and Watergate. This one is not really much of a mystery anymore, as we now know who wrote it. Why is the only mystery. Maybe it was out of some moral cause he believed he was fighting for, or maybe he was just a little off in the head. Imagine you're driving down the road when all of a sudden you hear a noise that every traveler hates, the smack of the windshield. You quickly look over and discover that long crack running down, or that huge dot where something penetrated the glass, maybe something like a gravel from a truck. But what if you were 100% sure nothing struck you while driving? Or what if you just came out to your car one morning to discover the window now had a small indenture on it? Or even that the whole windshield had been shattered completely? Strangely, there have been periods of time where this happened frequently with no clear explanation, specifically between 1952 and 1954. Numerous reports of this phenomenon were recorded in Canada and the US alike. But it wasn't just cars that suffered these weird shatterings. Glass windows in houses were also broken apart or started pitting. Now, as mentioned, if this was a one-off or just an isolated location, that would be one thing. But this happened in waves from 1954 all the way up to 1974, with thousands of automobiles randomly getting hit by this. There's not much to theories on this one, but the mystery is found in John Keel's book called The Cosmic Question, and he sort of tried to connect it to pollution that may or may not have been caused by human beings. He also suggested a similar outbreak of busted windshields in the 1920s that he believed could be tied to skyquakes. However, if you do a Google search today on spontaneous windshield shattering, you'll quickly see that this happens all the time, and it can be attributed to different factors, such as defects, thermal shock, or extreme temperature fluctuation. The chromal ray phacoray was an early 20th century medical device which involved a 100-watt lamp used for color therapy, or now known as chromotherapy, as a way to project rays of cool sunshine. The lamp worked by focusing light through colored lenses which simulated the sun, and was recommended to use in dreary weather or cold climates. It was just one of a long line of quack medical inventions in the early 20th century, but this one at least had origins going way back in time, with the ancient Egyptians using colored crystals and sunlight for healing, because according to believers of chromotherapy, the light can be used to promote mental and physical wellness. In fact, you can still use the chromo ray today, or numerous different types of mood lamps on Amazon. I'm not sure what the mystery is on this one. I think it's supposed to be, does it really work? I know times are hard right now, and it's quite possible you have applied for multiple jobs, never getting an interview. But what if I told you there is a research associate / personal assistant job posted right now that could pay you up to $100,000 a year? Well, you might think this sounds like a scam, but this one is actually a mystery, because in 2004, an ad would run in the classifieds of the New York Republic, a magazine, which read, "Ideal candidate would be highly intelligent, resourceful, and have exceptional communication skill, and would undertake special research projects and various administrative tasks on behalf of a busy executive." The ad goes on to further state that they welcome applications from writers, musicians, artists, and other candidates pursuing professional goals in their free time. They also state you would be working in a casual atmosphere in a beautiful space with gifted individuals. If interested, apply at mtgen2@gmail.com. Now, this ad already sounds vague enough and a little bit sketchy, but what makes it odd is this ad has now ran for over 20 years straight. In that time, it's barely changed. Although it used to be mtgen2@gmail.com in the original ads, it is now gen8@spfine.com. Other than that, there have only been minor alterations. The ad has also popped up on Craigslist under different variations. However, this is another one that has been partially solved, because the author seems to have been discovered. On the Craigslist ad, the email address was revealed to be Craig-Ginn at career.deshaw.com, an investment management firm known as D.E. Shaw, started by David E. Shaw in 1988. Why they are seeking talented individuals with such a vague ad in a magazine is still a mystery, however. The United States is Conscious is a conspiracy/philosophical thought experiment which tries to show that the US matches all of the materialist hallmarks of consciousness. For example, materialists argue that since rabbits are made of matter, have brains, nervous systems, and behave in ways which show awareness, then they must be conscious. And since they are conscious, it's natural to assume that if aliens exist, even though they are different than us, they too would be conscious beings. And since that is the case, then why can groups not be conscious? Even large groups, like a company or a country. Could the US, or any other nation, be like one big slow brain, using its communication networks, decision-making structures, memory, which might be its archives and records, as well as using its senses, like polls and surveillance tools, could be indicative that the US is a conscious entity. The theory goes on, but you get it. It's basically just an experiment to gauge if groups of people could serve as one consciousness. Over the 14th and 15th centuries, a war was waged which has since went down as one of the more important of all of Europe. I am of course talking about the 100 Years' War waged between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. And it's in this war that one of France's national heroes would come to prominence, Joan of Arc. At 17 years old, she convinced Charles VII that she was receiving visions and messages from saints, urging her to support the king in his attempt to drive the English out. She did such a good job that he would even let her lead an army at the Siege of Orleans in 1429, turning the tide of the war. Unfortunately, she would be captured the following year by Burgundian allies of the English, where she was put on trial and burned at the stake at just 19 years old in 1431. That is all basic history, and you probably already knew. But is it possible that was all a lie, and Joan really survived? That's what this next conspiracy theory alleges. And for good reason. It seems several young women would come forward after Joan's execution and claim to be her. The most famous example was that of Jeanne d'Armoise. She would come forward 5 years after, in 1436, claiming she was the real Joan and had miraculously escaped the execution. She was so convincing that even Joan's brother believed it was her. She would exploit her newfound fame to gain gifts and money over the next 4 years until 1440, when her charade was finally discovered. Or at least, that's what the accepted history states. Some modern-day authors have speculated on this account by suggesting that Joan really did take on the identity of Jeanne d'Armoise and married a French knight named Robert d'Armoise and lived a fairly normal life, even having a family. We'll start off here with Mount Kailash. Mount Kailash is a mountain located in the Tibet region of China that has long been surrounded by mystery and intrigue for a myriad of reasons. For one, the mountain is considered sacred to Hinduism, Jainism, and the Bon religion, and is thought to be the abode of Lord Shiva. Supposedly, no one has ever climbed the mountain and returned because those who attempt it face spiritual consequences. In fact, the Chinese government doesn't allow anyone to attempt scaling the mountain today, which of course makes it more mysterious. But there are other oddities, like the mountain is almost a perfect pyramid, with the sides aligning almost perfectly to the cardinal directions, leaving some to suggest that the mountain was man-made. There's also these accounts of odd lights surrounding the mountain or weird sounds coming from within. In fact, some theorize that China blocks off the mountain because of extraterrestrial activity that has been known to occur here, or because of a vast array of unexplained phenomena that takes place here, like time distortion, portals, or strange energy fields. Valentine's Day, 1988, Mount Vernon, New York. Near a junkyard of the industrial part of town, a resident would make a terrible discovery when he came across the nude deceased body of a young woman. As investigators arrived and looked over the scene, they soon discovered ligature marks on the lady's neck, wrist, and ankles, suggesting she was bound before being dumped here. The medical examiner suggested she had been killed earlier that morning and placed there around 10:20 a.m. based on an account from a passerby. An autopsy also found she had recent sexual activity, but whether or not this was forced is still unknown. They also would find a small amount of cocaine in her blood and broccoli in her stomach. The case quickly went cold because detectives didn't even know the identity, so a suspect was even more difficult to name. But fast forward to 2021 with the advancements of familial DNA testing, and after decades of the case lying cold, the Mount Vernon Jane Doe was finally identified as Ronnie Wiederhold, a 19-year-old woman. There's not publicly much that's been said about this case, so it's hard to speculate on. But detectives theorized early on that she may have been a sex worker since the autopsy revealed recent intercourse and cocaine use, and it's also possible she was victimized because of that. The Mayak Asambi at Jane Doe is the victim of the Russian serial killer Kangabesh Orenbaev, who was discovered in the streets of Ulan-Ude in July 2007. His reign of terror lasted between 1991 and 2012, and it's believed he ended up with at least 6 victims. One of these was this Jane Doe. When he was finally apprehended, he told police he met her and chatted with her sometime and shared some alcohol, and then he propositioned her for sex, to which she declined. This set him off and caused him to strangle her, where he then left her on a riverbank. He returned the next day, dismembered her, and threw her remains into the water. However, he never got her name, and she is yet to be identified. There's also some conflicting info on if any of her remains were ever recovered, which of course means that this could have been made up by the serial killer. All in all, since records from Russia are kinda sparse, there's not much on this one. Newcomb's paradox is another one of these philosophical thought experiments which gives the person a choice between 2 boxes, box A and box B. The choices are given to you by a super powerful predictor that is almost always right. In box A, you can see into, and inside it, it has $1,000. Box B, on the other hand, is closed, and you have no idea what's inside, and you are given the choice to take only box B or box A and box B. The catch is this: if the predictor accurately predicts that you will take box B only, it will put $1 million inside, but if it thinks you will take both A and B, it leaves box B empty. And don't forget, this predictor is very accurate, but you're left with a choice. Do you trust its accuracy and take box B, or do you go with logic and take both? Not really a mystery, but an interesting concept nonetheless. Another mega series video, another pooper story. This time, we go to New Orleans in 2016, where one resident began her day by waking up and leaving the home, only to find out someone had left a little duty on her steps. The person doing it went over a dozen times in the first month alone. At one point, he was doing it almost every morning. A security camera was then put up to catch a man wearing a disguise, usually wearing an obvious wig and women's clothing, sneaking over to her steps and letting go. The man was also noticeably a gym rat, as he was very muscular. He was also equipped with different wigs, pants, tops, and even a big bag. The woman was the only resident he targeted, which of course suggests a personal motive. But not to be outdone, we have another pooper, this time in Norway, and I'm just glad they're not all American. In this case, it's a little more odd, because it was a golf club that was targeted. And by that, I mean a club, like a social group, not an actual golf club, although that might have been funnier. It started in September 2020 in Stavanger, Norway, when someone infiltrated the golf course on weekdays only and started targeting the golf holes, but with his poop. In particular, he seemed to really like a couple of holes. And I say he because although the pooper was never seen, and I'm not kidding here, the golf course employees suspected that it was a man because his poo was too big to be a woman's. One morning, when they found a deposit, they looked around to see bicycle tracks that had been left on the dew-covered grass, where the poopatrator had rode in, parked his bike, and then walked over to the hole and let go. Now this pooper was dedicated, because the golf course installed floodlights and pointed them towards the holes as a method to deter him, but he ended up climbing a tree, wriggled out on a branch, and dismantled the light so he could keep pooping in the hole. Now that's dedication. Greys at the casino. If you know anything about aliens or UFOs, you have no doubt heard of the Greys, which is the most popular type of extraterrestrial being. They are often depicted with gray skin or gray clothing. For whatever reason, in most abduction cases, it's these humanoids that the abductee meets. But that's what adds the irony. Considering there's been so many claims, why isn't there any real documentable proof of them? Well, maybe there is, at least according to this little mystery, which strangely comes from a Las Vegas security guard. Apparently, sometime in 1994, this guard was monitoring the cameras when he noticed something odd. There were these three strange beings who wore robes and had these huge bald heads, just sitting at one of the tables gambling. He at first thought these people were wearing costumes, but that's when he noticed that no one else in the casino was even paying any attention to them despite their weird appearance. At some point, one of these beings would stare straight into the camera, even though it was hidden. The guard would go on to later claim that a man in black confiscated the original copies, but he had managed to take 2 photos of the video before it was taken. This one, there's not much in the way of theories on. Maybe it was the Greys, or maybe it was just a couple of dudes. Struve's Lost Nebula. Struve's Lost Nebula is a celestial object reported by famed astronomer Otto Wilhelm von Struve in 1868, and was later confirmed by astronomer Heinrich Louis de Rest. It was described as a magnificent or otherwise interesting object, variable, small, brown nucleus north of a star of the 13th magnitude. Why is this a mystery exactly? Well, it's never been seen again, or at least no other astronomer since has been able to find it, leaving the question, where did it go? The theories vary, but it could have just been a transient object like a temporary gas cloud, or maybe a mistake by both men, or even something wrong with the instruments they were using, or they could have just recorded the coordinates inaccurately. Smiling Sister on the Roof. This one comes from personalghoststories.com and is rather short, but comes from a nurse documenting an experience she had as a young child around the age of 10. She would state that one day she had stayed home from school because she was feeling ill. Luckily, her 20-year-old sister, who was her best friend and was in college at the time, happened to be home, and even though she had been sick, our would-be nurse must have felt better by 2 p.m. because she would ask her older sister to play hide and seek with her, and she agreed, and the older sister went to hide. So the little girl begins counting and then goes to look for her older sister, when suddenly she looked up and seen her, standing on top of the roof of the garage. Now obviously, this little girl was not prepared for this, and had no idea how to get up there, and just looked at her and smiled and said, "Come down." About the time she said that, she heard a voice behind her saying, "Who are you talking to?" And obviously, it was her sister behind her. So, who was the person on the garage? The person who submitted this account did state that the house was pretty old, and someone in the past had died in a fire in the garage. She even noted the burn marks were still in some of the wood, but other than that, she didn't give any theories. So, I will. The most logical one was a fever-induced hallucination, which would make sense since she was sick. Then you get the theories like pareidolia, seeing random patterns where they don't actually exist. Of course, there's the supernatural theories too, like doppelganger phenomenon, or a haunting, which goes along with the fire. Limb of the unknown child. Cemeteries, love them or hate them, are a cultural pillar of mankind. Even in countries like Japan, where the highest percentage of cremation takes place, cemeteries are still common. But it's at this one cemetery in Davenport, Iowa, known as the Oakdale Memorial Gardens, that a strange and unsettling mystery lives. On a nondescript tombstone with the epitaph that simply reads, "Limb of unknown child." This, of course, has led to a lot of questions, a lot of disturbing questions. A tombstone with an unknown child is depressing enough, but one with a child's leg? Very strange. Making it more odd is the fact that there's not even a date listed on the stone. But it gets stranger yet. The interment records for this burial and actual location of the arm don't even match. The limb is located in the section of TE of the orphan's lot, but the interment records show that the burial location is actually TF. The leg is also listed as Grave 001, and the two closest headstones to that belong to a Jesse Rodecker, who died in 1883 with the location of TE001, while Dorothy Birch, who died in 1949, is in TE001A, and neither of these people lost a limb. Actually, a local newspaper has done a lot of research on this, trying to find out who the limb belonged to, and basically, no orphans from there were missing a limb. So, whose was it? And why is it even here? Square windowed boxcar. The next one has almost zero information about it. Basically, it involves a sighting from a couple driving in Berwickshire, Scotland in February 1977. Their names were Stan and Edith, and a last name was never divulged. Regardless, as they went along the road in this cold winter night, they passed what was essentially a boxcar made completely of square windows. I'm sure they found it odd, but the account does not mention if they could see anyone on the inside of this weird craft. But it was only made stranger by the fact that they had seen weird lights in the sky in the past few months leading up to this. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, not a lot of info. But it was more than likely they just misidentified a vehicle. Maybe even a flatbed truck carrying a glass structure. Pinos Altos, New Mexico photo. In this series, we have taken a look at some of the oldest UFO reports in history. But reports are one thing. What is the actual oldest photograph that documents a UFO? That actually goes back to March 7th, 1901, in the town of Pinos Altos, New Mexico, where a man named S.H. Milliken would see an airship and quickly grab his camera and take a photo of it, which couldn't have been too quick back then. Its description is quite strange, as it's really three cigar-shaped objects that seem to be lashed together. Now interestingly, after the original photo was taken, it disappeared for over 70 years, only to reappear and quickly be denounced as nothing more than kites. Others, however, believe S.H. Milliken was most likely standing behind a window screen, and the UFO was just debris or grain stuck to the screen. Of course, this was just a few years after the whole 1897 airship sightings phenomenon that took place all over the US, so it's quite possible this was some kind of secret experimental aircraft. Winslow cow carcass. Imagine walking outside going about your everyday business and you just happen to look up in the sky and see one of the most bizarre sightings ever. And no, I'm not talking about a UFO. Instead, there is a dead cow hanging from the wires of a telephone pole. That's actually what would happen to the residents of Winslow, New Jersey in the 1960s. The photo you see here is really unexplained, although many point to the legendary cryptid/beast, Jersey Devil, as being the reason for this poor cow being hung from the line. Of course, the Jersey Devil had not been seen much since the early 1900s, so it's hard to believe it could be responsible, which has led many to report seeing Bigfoot in the area as being the culprit. However, it was most likely just a prank by some locals. Matt's head. Matt's head is one of those strange internet relics from the early days of photo sharing and basically shows a man sitting on a sofa with a bookshelf behind him. And, tucked neatly into the shelf, almost unnoticeable at first, is a head. Yes, on the shelf. According to the description, Matt was on a road trip in Canada with a digital camera and some other people, including his nephew, who was taking some pictures along the way. And at some point, after going through the pictures, they discovered this man's head randomly sitting in the background. However, it's most likely just a cutout mask or printout, and actually has a flat appearance. Cooper Street Snake. What do you get when you mix a cryptid mystery with an anomaly and, just for good measure, lost media? Well, you get the Cooper Street Snake mystery, of course. The story began sometime around 1910, when the first reports of this tourist attraction in Manhattan began popping up in newspapers. And it was basically this giant fossilized snake that had been embedded into the rock. The story got popular enough that geologists came from all over just to study it. This along with the tourists coming to see it, made it one of the most visited attractions in the area. The snake fossil was about 25 foot in size, and the papers at the time stated that geologists suggested that the snake was probably caught in rocks during an upheaval of the earth over 2,000 years ago. The head and body of the snake are pretty clear, and its shape suggests he was very surprised or startled from the earthquake which led to its demise. One article would close by stating that there was an intent to have the rock preserved by the Museum of Natural History, but that never happened, and the snake has been lost. How does one lose a rock outcropping that size? Well, that's the tricky part. First of all, not everyone agreed that what was seen was a snake. Some people believe it was nothing more than random weathering, but it still leaves the mystery. What happened to the rock? And if it was a snake, what kind was it? Well, considering it was over 2,000 years ago, there would have been no invasive species like pythons that would have been released yet, so the biggest snake would have been about 9 feet, which is the anomaly portion of the mystery. But let's say it wasn't a snake and just a natural pattern. Still, what happened to the rock? Francis Bacon is a name I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The noted English philosopher and statesman served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England under King James between the years of 1613 and 1621, but he's known more for his contributions to science, especially when it comes to his influence on the scientific revolution. But could he be influential in a way that most people would never consider? I'm of course talking about the occult. Apparently, there's been a long-held theory of this, and it's multi-layered and kinda all over the place, but we'll touch up on a few tidbits. First of all, is his said connection to the Freemasons, which is often tied up with the fact that he would meet with these men at a local inn where they would discuss politics, philosophy, and share ideas. Although I could not find a source on who these mysterious men were and what group they were tied to, but it's always been alleged they were some sort of secret society. Then there's his connection to the Rosicrucians, another sort of secret spiritual movement in the 17th century. Bacon was also known to host banquets that were attended by some of the most important men of his time. This included scholars, authors, scientists, lawyers, diplomats, and foreign dignitaries. Next is the idea that we sort of touched upon in a previous video, the true authorship of Shakespeare. This is a big conspiracy which alleges that Shakespeare, if he existed, only wrote some of his works, or maybe none of them, and instead they were written by many other writers, or perhaps just one. In this case, our one is Francis Bacon. But there's even more, as some people believe that Bacon actually faked his own death. The theory states that after years of secretly funding the Freemasons and other secret societies, and funding a series of plays that he wrote under a pen name, Bacon ended up in a huge amount of debt, a debt that he could only escape by faking his death and spending the rest of his life living under a disguise while he traveled through Europe. He may have even continued to write up until 1670 using the name Comte de Gabalis. However, none of this has ever been proven. The odor of sanctity is allegedly a sweet floral perfume that legends insist surrounds the bodies or relics of holy men and women. In some of the earliest documents from the beginning of the church and all the way up through medieval Europe, this fragrance is described as unearthly, a mingling of rose, jasmine, and incense that defies decay and hints at the soul's triumph over the tomb. According to the tradition, the odor often appears at the moment of a saint's death or during veneration of their remains. Witnesses speak of entering a dank crypt or a cramped cell and being struck by a sudden rush of sweetness so intense that you can't smell the normal decay. Skeptics, though, don't believe it and chalk it up to natural perfumes or well-tended flowers. Yet, in countless accounts, the scent persists even when no blooms are present, even when the air is cold and still, with some people even claiming that the scent is strong enough that it drifts down hallways far from the chapel or crypt. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1957, of Old Saybrook, Connecticut, retired teacher Mary M. Starr was jolted awake by an otherworldly glow beyond her bedroom window. Just waking up, she at first mistook the radiant orb for a downed aircraft, but as she drew closer, she realized this was no wreck. Suspended above her clothesline was a silent craft. Through the vessel's broad square windows, she seen two entities drift past one another. Their forms did not seem to be earthly. It had no arms, instead ending in smooth stumps, with transparent cubic heads glowing with ruby cores, and rubbery torsos flaring outward. No legs were visible, but their slender silhouettes suggested they were around 4 foot tall. As her heart raced, the windows themselves blinked out of existence, leaving the whole of a senseless expanse of polished metal. From the object came a shimmering antenna, spiraling skyward before the entire surface of the craft rippled into a soft incandescent glow that bathed the yard in surreal light for several trembling minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it reversed. The hull's luminescence dimmed, the antenna retracted, and the object executed a series of looping maneuvers over the neighborhood rooftops. It then shot straight up into the sky, vanishing from sight. So what was it? Since this was during the Cold War, an experimental military aircraft can't be ruled out. Or maybe it was something like ball lightning, but it's just as likely this was a sleep hallucination. Let's say you were playing two games. Game A is straightforward, a single coin toss that favors the house, offering you a slim chance of victory and a larger chance of loss. Play long enough, and that sad edge will grind you down. Game B cranks up the complexity, making your odds depend on the very coin flips you've already faced. If your current balance is a multiple of some number, say 3, you're handed a heavily biased coin that leans against you. Otherwise, you will get a slightly more forgiving one, meaning in both cases, you will likely lose. Here's where the paradox lies. If you alternate between Game A and Game B in a fixed pattern, or even choose between them at random, the combined process flips from losing to winning. The secret lies in how the losing trends of one game bleed into another, breaking the steady drift toward ruin and instead nudging the overall balance upward. Mathematicians trace this reversal to subtle correlations. Game B's state-dependent coins create pockets of opportunity that Game A's losses help reset, preventing the system from sticking in deep losing cycles. It's as though each game pushes you toward the other's strengths, crafting a balance that no single play could achieve on its own. Not really a mystery, but an interesting concept nonetheless. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was an English poet in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His most famous work may be the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which gained some fame among heavy metal fans after a song of the same name appeared on Iron Maiden's Power Slave. But it's not that poem that is the center of our next mystery. Instead, it's the poem called Kubla Khan, which Coleridge composed one night after an opium-influenced dream. The poem itself is not important to our discussion. Instead, it's what happened during the writing of the poem. After waking up from this dream, he quickly grabbed his pen and paper and began writing before he could forget it. But right at that moment, a man showed up and knocked on the door of Coleridge's home. This man would tell him he was from Porlock and was there on business. This man, who was never identified, kept Coleridge tied up for about an hour while he rambled on. Before he finally left, Coleridge would rush back in to jot down the rest of the poem, and he had already forgot most of the dream, other than just a few lines. The mystery, of course, is who was this man that caused Coleridge to forget the major parts of this dream, which he intended to capture in a poem, thereby leaving it forever in a fragmentary form. The most likely theory, at least postulated by later writers, is that Coleridge simply could not finish the poem and created the story to not only explain why it wasn't finished, but to create this aura of strangeness around it. Other theories suggest he was simply a neighbor or peddler, or perhaps a hallucination caused by the opium. Usually, when it comes to unsolved crime, in particular, murders, we do deep dives. However, in this next one, there's not much info available due to a few circumstances. First of all is the name, the Pittsburgh Serial Murders. See, this Pittsburgh is in California. not the Pittsburgh that everyone knows, which of course really hinders a Google search. Secondly, the crimes came in 1998 and 1999, at a time when the city was already suffering through a really high crime rate, sorta masking the fact that this serial killer was on the loose. Finally, is the pattern itself, in which I mean, there's not one. Unlike the cliche where the killer has a particular type of victim or a very distinct MO, in this case, there was nothing like that. The first victim was a 27-year-old, Michael Tan, whose remains were found in a ditch on November 9th, 1998. He had been beaten and drowned. This was the only male victim, and the only one who did not live in Pittsburgh. Interestingly, his relatives and friends all stated he didn't even know anyone from the area, which makes it stranger. Although, in his case, it's likely he walked into his apartment during the middle of a robbery. 5 days later, the remains of a 15-year-old, Lisa Norrell, was found near a local business after being reported missing 8 days prior. She had been strangled. Then, fast forward a few weeks later to December 5th, and a 27-year-old sex worker, Jessica Frederick, was found stabbed to death, followed 8 days later by 32-year-old Rachel Cruz, who had a drug addiction and was frequently in the company of other sex workers. This one sticks out because, not far from her murder, another sex worker was badly assaulted but survived. She would describe the attacker as a Hispanic male with a dark Chevy Monte Carlo. The attacks cooled off for a month, but on January 8th, 1999, the body of 27-year-old Valerie Schultz was found in a ditch. In Valerie's case, she had been a sex worker about 4 years prior and had even moved away from Pittsburgh, and she had actually just came back for this 1 week when she was murdered. She had been staying in a motel, and witnesses described a Hispanic or Samoan male between 30 to 40 driving a faded brown car with a noisy muffler picking her up. So what do we have here? 5 murders, 3 on sex workers, or former sex workers. 2 seem to be completely unrelated, while 3 of the 4 were committed by different methods, although the method in Valerie's murder was never disclosed. Now what's crazy is, in spite of how random and unrelated these look, investigators are confident all 5 were committed by the same individual, which suggests they must have some kind of DNA proof. In fact, DNA would be used to rule out one suspect in 2001, while there have been at least 4 other suspects that have been ruled out over the years. My guess is this one is eventually solved. In the spring of 2011, Pittsburghers of Pennsylvania began stumbling upon a very peculiar sight: plastic protractors, those curved relics of geometry class, and they were glued to mailboxes, benches, and bridge railings across the city. At first glance, they seemed like random tokens just kinda left about, but upon closer inspection, each one of them was stamped with a bold number and painted in hues of cobalt, crimson, emerald, and lavender, as if someone were secretly counting the city's hidden corners. No 2 placements told the same story. Some protractors sat high up on a lamppost, others clung to the underpass, their arcs echoing the steel bridges above, superglued into place, inviting passerbys to wonder who would painstakingly place these in such odd locations. University of Pittsburgh alumnus Eric Legee took up the quest to chronicle their spread, mapping nearly 500 of these silent markers between 2011 and 2013. His chart revealed no grand design. There was no spiral, no cryptic messages, just clusters that hinted at aimless paths and sudden leaps from one neighborhood to the next. The numbers climbed into the mid-400s, yet their sequence stubbornly refused to reveal a single pattern. Speculation swirled. Was this the art project of a citywide tagger? Or a frustrated mathematician? Or something else altogether? Today, most of the protractors have disappeared, removed by city crews or carried off by souvenir hunters, leaving this little mystery unsolved.